Soul Night Live, number 44, special daytime edition. Today's show is The History of Yes. And my co-hosts today are Henry Potts in the UK and Emmerich Leroy in France. All righty, let's get Henry in here first.
Hi, Sean.
Hey, Henry, how are you?
I'm good. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. It's good to speak with you. I feel like I've known you for a long time via our various musical hangouts on the internet. So it's nice to get a chance to chat with you in real time and look at a cat butt all at the same time.
I thought you needed to see a cat butt.
Yes, that's right. Very Prague.
You can sit down, cat. Yeah, it's lovely to see you. I have been enjoying Soul Night Live.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed putting it together, and every week's an adventure, and sometimes I don't know what I'm going to talk about, but we always figure it out. Let me go ahead and get Emmerich in here, and then we'll talk a bit about how each of you came to love Yes and do what you do, and
Sure.
We'll go from there. Then we'll go down memory lane. Now, that's a nice backdrop.
It worked.
Emmerich, good to see you.
Can you hear me?
I can. You sound great.
I'm using my my loudspeakers. It's not creating any echo or whatever.
I don't hear anything yet, no.
Good.
If it becomes a problem, I'll let you know.
Yeah, I have my headset.
So this setting behind you, tell us about it.
It's the city where I am, called Grenoble.
Okay, in France. Okay,
The Winter Olympics in 1968.
very
So I'm
good.
not exactly there, but I'm quite near. So it's
Very cool. Okay, well, that's a beautiful backdrop you got there. It beats looking at my backyard.
Yeah. Hi,
Especially with-
Henry.
I'm Rick.
Okay, I can
Meet the
hear you.
cat.
Oh, I've read about that animal.
All right, well, thank you both for being part of this. I think we all love Yes in equal measure, and I was just kind of curious how each of you kind of came to know their music, and then what inspired you, in Henry's case, to create his website and where it is and how to find it. And Emmerich, about your book that you wrote. So Henry, why don't you let us know first, Yes experience and kind of what led you to become the greatest curator of Yes information on the internet.
So I think I heard Wondrous Stories when I was a kid. But I got into Yes when I went to college. And, I found a group of friends and we used to hang out in this one guy's room. And he had a CD player. And I hadn't met a CD player in the flesh before. And he only really had 3 CDs. He had Rush's Hold Your Fire and Power Windows, and he had 90125. So that's what we'd listen to over and over. And I fell in love with all of them. And I particularly fell in love with 90125, and I think it was It Can Happen in particular. So it went from there. I didn't know anything about this band. I didn't know what I was meant to like or not like as a Yes fan. I just knew I liked this album, so I just randomly bought these other albums that said Yes on the cover. And I think I got, in fairly short succession, Drama, Big Generator, Classic Yes, and the Yes album. And I liked all of those, and I just kept going.
Okay. And what inspired you to start your website, and when did you start that? I want to say mid-90s?
Late 90s.
Okay.
So I got into Yes. And then around the mid-90s, I discovered Usenet and the web. And I discovered out.music.progressive and out.music.yes, these online discussion places. And they were really exciting. And every morning I would log on excitedly, and there'd often be, as many as 5 or 6 messages. And it
Emails,
was,
right?
um, and I rapidly learned about Yes from that. And I discovered Notes from the Edge, which used to be the Yes newsletter, the Yes online newsletter, and that had been going for a while. And so I just read through all of its archives in short succession, and that taught me a huge amount. And I just dived in, and I loved it, and I loved meeting these other people who liked Yes, who liked prog more generally, and at some point, a lot of groups had facts, frequently asked questions, and it seemed like out.music.yes could do with one. So I think I just started that, and then as a companion to that, I just wanted to track for my own interest what the band were doing, and initially it was in fact what the solo stuff was doing. What was Steve Howarth doing? What was people who weren't currently in the band doing, like Trevor Horn. And so I just sort of started putting this all on a web page because I thought, oh well, I want to remember what all of this stuff is and what's going on, so I might as well share it with other people. And other people liked it, which was lovely, and it grew, and people send me stuff, and I just kept going.
All these years later, yeah. And remind everybody where it's located at.
It's if you Google Yes, where are they now, you should find it.
Okay, well, that's easy enough to find. And what's the address? I always wondered how to pronounce that.
www.bondagazoo.co.uk.
Okay. What inspired that name?
What inspired Bondagazoo? Around the same time as all this was going on, I was working in an office at a university, and the Bondagazoo had just recently been discovered, and everyone in the office was very taken by this discovery of this new animal. It's a type of tree kangaroo. It's very cute, and it looks utterly ridiculous. It's a kangaroo, but it climbs trees, and it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it doesn't. Okay, very cool. It definitely sticks in your head. It's like I couldn't quite recall what it was, but I could remember how to spell it. So that's how I find you. But you all don't have to go through all that trouble. Just Yes, where are they now? Yeah, and it's definitely the most thorough collection of Yes information on the internet, as far as I can tell. So thank you for putting it all together in one spot that makes it easy to find. And it's an ongoing thing for you. I mean, even to this day.
Thanks for the praise. And what makes it work is that, I update it just by following all the Yes news I can find, but also readers from around the world. If I miss something, someone will soon email me and say, hey, did you see this interview? Or, ooh, I bumped into someone and they said this. And it's that community participation, which means that I can keep up to date on everything.
Sure. Excellent. All righty. Well, Emmerich, tell us about your book and what it's called. And actually, let's go back first. How did you find Yes, and when?
In the mid '80s, I was a teenager and listening to what was going on musically, more like synth pop kind of stuff. And around the late '80s, I began to travel back in time with all the CD reissues that were coming out. And I became a fan of prog in general, starting with Pink Floyd, actually. And pretty soon I discovered all the other bands. And I became really aware of Yes around the time ABWH was coming out. And they had a gig lined up here in Grenoble, but it was cancelled at the last minute. There was a whole French leg of the tour that was cancelled because John Anderson had troubles with his voice. And so the first time I saw them was on the Union tour, also in Grenoble. In 1993, I formed a magazine called Big Bang, which is still going. It's a progressive rock paper magazine. And I became involved in writing articles about prog and Yes specifically. Later on, I created this website called Calyx, which is about the Canterbury scene. So that got me into the internet. And actually, that's how I came to know Henry, because he was a subscriber of my newsletter service called What's Rattlin'. And it turned out that he was not only a fan of Canterbury, but also a very knowledgeable fan of Yes. And actually, at the time, I was going to London quite often to do research for what became my book on the Canterbury scene. And we used to meet up with Henry. So that was 20 years ago when I was going to the British Library, because it was quite near there. And so we met quite a few times back then. So I began writing books a few years later, and the Yes book is my latest. So it came out 3 years ago. But all my books are in French so far. I mean, there's the Canterbury book is hopefully coming out very soon in English. The translation is finished, and eventually maybe the Yes book will come out in English too. But
Okay.
I exchanged quite a bit with Henry during the making of the book, because he's always on the case with all the background information that I needed to tell people about the making of the albums. So I would consult him not only about that, but also on the meaning of John Anderson's lyrics, because as a French person, there's a bit of subtlety that I need help with in the way, I mean, the kind of meaning or images conveyed by the words. Sometimes with Yes, it's quite a strange middle ground sometimes. So I needed some help, and he was quite helpful with all my questions.
Well, even in English, sometimes it's hard to discern
Yeah, I
exactly
know.
what he's
Yeah.
talking about, but and sometimes that's the best part, I
Yeah.
think. He became much more literal in the 90s and beyond.
Yeah.
Back in the 70s, sometimes he would just string words together because they sounded interesting. And I
Yeah.
think that added a bit to the kind of mystical quality of them. When he started just coming out and saying what was on his mind, it was nice. It was very positive stuff, but it didn't leave a lot to interpret. That's kind
Yeah, I
of
mean, there's examples like Turn of the Century is the first time he really tried to tell an actual story, and that was a very good one.
oh yeah, that was great.
But the sort of middle ground he found between, I guess, the original phonetic ideas that came to him and trying then to rationalize them into a sort of storyline or talking about something more specific, that was indeed quite interesting. And also it worked well with the music, because there was the kind of impressions brought by the music and what was conveyed by the words. It made a nice mixture. It didn't necessarily work as poetry on its own, but the mixture was quite effective.
Yeah, well, I thought they all had a very positive angle, and yes, music is positive anyway, so it all went together nicely, I think. Okay, well, I guess I should tell you a little bit about my Yes journey. You know, I had a musician friend who had a really extensive record collection when I was about, I don't know, 13 or so. And he was a little older than me, and I would go over and dig through his albums. And the Yes one just kind of caught my eye. I like any kind of band that has a thematic thread that ties their albums together, be it visually or otherwise. And I kind of saw that with just the logo being repeated and such. And so I put on Fragile, and as soon as Roundabout started, I thought, oh, I know this. I heard this on the AM radio as a child. I didn't know who it was, but I'd certainly heard that song. And so it's like, oh, so that was Yes. Okay. And then Close to the Edge followed, and that was gobsmacking. It was hard to comprehend and very exotic, and that was the fun of it. It kept me wanting to come back and discover more about it. And then the Yes album, that was really accessible from the get-go. And then, so my friend sent me home with those three, but he also put Drama in the pile. He said, you're into metal, and this is probably their heaviest album, so check this out. Machine Messiah, that's pretty heavy. And I didn't even realize it was a different singer. And I don't think I cared. I didn't know who any of the people were. I just thought I liked this music. And then I guess, and that was a few years before 90125 came out. And at first, when it came out, I was a bit of a Steve Howe fanboy, and so I was kind of like, I don't know about this new Yes, but it won me over pretty quickly being on MTV, and I love Chris Squire's playing, and he was front and center in this one as well. So there was lots of that to enjoy from a bass perspective. So it grew on me pretty quickly. And then we had an opportunity to go see the 90125 tour for $14. And they really won me over. That was a hot band, and they played enough of the old stuff to make me happy. And the new stuff, was really growing on me. So I was kind of, a fan for life after that. And gosh, I don't know how many times I've seen them. I mean, not nearly as many as some people, because I don't leave town to go see them. I don't chase them around. I just wait for them to come to me. So, 20 times, something like that, I suppose, at this point. So when was the last time you saw Yes, Henry?
That would be the last time they were in the UK. Was that the 50th anniversary?
Yeah, probably so.
Yeah. So obviously the shows this year have been cancelled, and hopefully we'll see them next year. Although who knows with the pandemic. So the 50th anniversary shows, they did 2 shows on the same weekend in London, and we had a mini Yes festival for one of the days. So that was a great event, great to meet lots of people again. You see the same faces going to Yes shows again and again, and you get to know people.
Absolutely.
We also had some exciting additional events. So we had Fragile with Claire Hamill doing a set as well.
Oh, very nice. Okay. And was this the show where Mraz and Brislin and everybody came, and Horn? Was that one of those?
That show was in the States.
Oh.
We didn't get Mraz or Brislin. Bill Bruford introduced one of the shows. Okay. Didn't play a note, but he came on stage beforehand and did a nice little speech. And we got Trevor Horn as a guest.
Very nice. Did he sit in and sing?
Yeah.
Okay. Very cool. I've seen some footage of him doing that at different times, and still sounds pretty darn good all these years later. That stuff's not easy to sing.
It was some fun shows.
Yeah. Okay. And Emmerich, how about you?
It was a couple of years ago on the Topographic Drama tour, and we also had Trevor Horn in Paris, sitting in or standing in Tempus Fugit. Otherwise, yes, it was the mixture of topographic and not topographic drama actually, because drama was the tour before in Europe. It's not quite the same as in the US. So we had topographic and a sort of best of selection. But other than that, I've seen them on practically, every tour they've done. I usually go see them in Paris, and when possible at another place like Brussels, or usually I try to catch them twice on each tour. And I also saw the ARW on one of their rare Continental Europe.
Oh, nice.
Brussels, because they didn't play France at all.
Okay, yeah, well, that was a really special tour, so I'm glad you got to see that. Did you see that as well, Henry?
Yes, so I saw there was a sort of mini day of prog festival. So we got a long Roger Hodgson set before
nice.
ARW, and also some bands have been playing, I think, from noon. Big arena show.
Very cool. Yeah, that was a great tour. I'm glad they had a chance to get together. So, and did not expect that to happen. So that was, any show post Chris Squire is kind of gravy, I think, you know what I mean? Like we've already been given so much, and then it's like, well, we're not quite done yet. So I think that's great. All right. Well, I think the last show I saw was the 50th anniversary. I think they had a tour since then where they played Gates, but it didn't come around here. It was pretty short, I think. But I saw some footage of it, and I thought they played it pretty well. So that Relayer tour might work out well. I find it hard to believe they're going to be ready to go in April, but or was it them? Maybe I'm thinking of Genesis. Well, anybody.
Yeah, it's supposed to be in the spring. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
So
fingers crossed. Maybe they can find a way to social distance and keep it safe. We want to keep them safe too. That's.
they might do it with bubbles like the Flaming Lips did.
I think that's a good idea. I remember that one that Peter Gabriel bounced around in about 10 years back. That was
Yeah, but the Flaming Lips thing is really COVID designed. I mean, people are each in a bubble.
Everyone in their own
Strange.
bubble.
Yeah. I don't know. Well, we'll see.
They could get Roger Dean to design specific bubbles. It would be great.
Yeah, no doubt. I like the way you're thinking there. I've created a bit of a PowerPoint presentation that we can share and kind of look at the different albums. So I thought we would, kind of start at the beginning and look at each lineup and album. Soul Night Live, episode 44. We're looking at the history of arguably the greatest influential progressive rock band of all time, Yes, with my co-hosts Henry Potts and Emric Leroy. So, gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to chat today. And we'll go ahead and get rolling here. So give everybody a little bit of background about Yes before they formed, like who came from where and how did John and Chris meet?
I think I was thinking back to when I first got into online Yes fandom and how we saw the band then and how we see the band now. And our view of the history has changed as history does. And the story used to be, in liner notes or in books, that Yes sort of appeared in 1968 all of a sudden, but really Yes emerges out of this other band called Mabel Greer's Toy Shop. And initially you've got Chris Squire and Pete Banks joined that band. Initially no one from Yes is in that band, but Squire and Banks join. And eventually Anderson joins and Bruford joins. And when Bill Bruford writes about his first show in Yes, it's now clear that his first show in Yes, they were still called Mabel Greer's Toy Shop. And eventually all the people who had been in Mabel Greer's Toy Shop, who we haven't heard of, had all left. And it was then that they sort of decide to rename themselves as Yes. So Yes didn't emerge from nothing. It emerges out of Mabel Greer's Toy Shop.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
And before that, there was the Sin, though. I mean, the roots of the Squire and Banks part of Yes was in the Sin, which was a longer lived and more, with more output kind of band. And indeed, John Anderson met Chris Squire. You asked how they met. John had come back from Germany, where he was touring with various cover bands, and he'd found a job cleaning the tables at a club called La Chasse, which was where the musicians who played gigs at the Marquee would gather after gigs to drink. And he was quite friendly with the owner there. And one day Squire turned up, and the owner got them to meet, and they started talking, and they found they had quite a lot of musical ambitions in common. And that very same night, the story goes, they wrote Sweetness, I think, right?
So that was the very first Yes song.
Yeah,
first
sort
original.
of May '68.
All right, let's see. So this is the first. Oh, by the way, actually, it's episode 44. I got ahead of myself, but anyhow, this is the wonderful Roger Dean font. In case you all ever want to make your own stuff at home look like Yes stuff, it's out there and it's free. I think this first appeared on the ABWH album. Anyhow, here's the first Yes. It's Tony Kaye, Peter Banks, John Anderson, Bill Bruford, and Chris Squire. What can you guys tell us about this picture? Any ideas?
Clearly not an actual performance,
Right.
or is it? It probably, but there's no PA or anything. So what would you say, Henry?
I don't know. It's a well-known early photo. I love it as a photo. Pete Banks in full Pete Townsend-esque guitar mode. Chris Squire just looking so imposing. But the lack of PA is odd.
Yeah, maybe it's for some sort of lip sync television thing or something.
Yeah.
Tony Kaye is not using even his right hand.
Well, that was his 80s style, wasn't it? You know, with one of them, the one hand in the air while playing a chord.
Yeah, well, I think he did that pretty early on.
Oh yeah, I guess that was kind of
Yeah,
his
he always
thing.
played mostly with the right hand.
Yeah. So let's see what else we have here. All right. So they made an album, and it has two different covers.
69, actually.
69. Okay, I am corrected. Okay, and this is the British cover with the original bubble logo, and then in the States they had this one. Do you know anything about this picture, like where this was taken at?
Parliament Hill Fields, I think, right?
What do you suppose it is? It almost looks like they went to a place that makes like tombstones and other stoneworks.
So they're a London band, and you can wander around London, and you can see some of the things, some of the places where some of these early photos are taken. So if you go to West London, you can see the house they all lived in, where there's a famous photo of. This may have been taken around Parliament Hill Fields, which is where I live, and it's very close to where Mabel Greer's Toy Shop were active. They used to rehearse upstairs in a pub that's a short walk from me. But I don't actually recognize at all where this was.
Yeah, I'm guessing whatever it is has been torn down by now. It's a compelling picture with the big eagles up there on the roof and such. So yeah, that was the first one. And then and what kind of gigs were they playing early on?
Yeah, sorry, Henry, go ahead.
No, you go.
They played, I think I worked out, they played like 200 gigs in a year in 69, I think. And about 70% of them were in London or in the suburbs. So there was quite a dense network of pubs and venues around London. So they really got their act together, working almost every night and sometimes being asked at the last minute. I mean, their first major gig where they actually found their manager was a last-minute call replacing Sly and the Family Stone because Sly Stone didn't turn up, and they found themselves playing in this club. It wasn't the Speakeasy; it was the other, the same owner, but who became Jack Barry, who became their manager because they saved the day for him that night. And it so happened that they had people like Pete Townsend and Keith Emerson in the audience that night. They were virtually unknown. And so they got this management deal out of this appearance, which bought them the Hammond organ and the drum kit that Bill Bruford used from then on.
That's awesome. And then another last minute gig was when they were asked to open for Cream's last show at the Royal
That
Albert
wasn't
Hall.
last minute because
That
they had
wasn't?
enough time to ask Bruford to go to Leeds and ask Bruford a couple of weeks in advance. They knew their replacement drummer called Tony O'Reilly wasn't good enough. I think he had a drink problem as well. And when they turned up in Leeds, where Bruford had left the band and he'd gone on to study in Leeds, and they played a very bad gig apparently, and Bruford was asked to join them initially just for that one strategic gig opening for Cream at the Royal Albert Hall, and eventually Bruford was persuaded to rejoin full time.
Yeah, well, thank you for that.
So before even this first album, they've already changed the lineup because Bill Bruford leaves to go to college, to get a proper career, and they get this drummer Tony O'Reilly who was in a Liverpool band called the Coubars. There is, if you look online, there's one promo shot of the band with O'Reilly in it, but there's no known recordings with him. But he doesn't work out. He has been described as being alcoholic. I believe he's now passed away, and I don't know that he ever talked about his time in Yes. But they persuade Bruford out of a proper career and back into being a musician.
Well, that's noteworthy in itself. So that's an interesting twist of fate. And then, you know, that gig at Royal Albert Hall, I mean, that's a biggie. I mean, that's a legendary show for Cream. So, you know, to open for them, that was a pretty special thing. And I think that's the one where Bruford said he like dropped his sticks in the middle of a song or something.
Something's coming. Yeah, I think.
Yeah. I think talk a bit about, yeah. Early on, would you say they were more a cover band than an original band? Did they get out and just play covers early on and then wrote the stuff for the first album?
So early on, they're mainly playing covers, although they're interpreting those covers from the beginning, as far as we know. They inherit a few Mabel Greer's Toy Shop songs, like Beyond and Before, that Mabel Greer's Toy Shop have been playing. And they're gradually introducing more of their own material. What I think both of the first two Yes albums, though, they were a young band. They weren't used to the studio, and they hadn't learned how to capture what they were doing live. So we have hints that the live band was quite different from what perhaps you hear on Yes or Time in a Word. We have some live in the studio BBC recordings, which often seem to me to have much more energy to them. We know the band management are working on a early years box set. It's not clear when it might appear, but hopefully 2021. And maybe that will give us more of a sense of what they could be live.
Excellent. I would say the cover of I See You by the Byrds on the first album is probably the closest to what I think they were sounding like live, because they had this guitar and drums duo in the middle. It sounded very much like a live crowd pleaser. And from what I can hear in the few bootlegs recordings that exist, it's a good representation of their sound. And indeed, there's quite a few originals on the first two albums, but you can see that even into 69, they were still playing mostly covers live. They didn't play a lot of that original material live, and the set was pretty much based on the covers they had, which many of which are the best songs on those albums anyway, like Every Day's No Opportunity Necessary, and I See You.
And there are other covers we know that they played live, but which haven't sadly been captured.
Eleanor Rigby is one that's we have a version of that one.
So there's a really terrible audio recording of the band playing Eleanor Rigby, but the performance is fantastic. So full of energy. As I understand it, there is a good recording of the band playing Eleanor Rigby now in the band's management's possession. So hopefully we will get to hear it at some point.
Excellent. And, you know, I think it should be noted that when Yes played a cover, it was never a straight up rendering of what was on the record. You know, they yesified it, you know, extremely in many cases. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, just the way they treated those songs was very much inspired, I think, by what Vanilla Fudge were doing in the US. They've always said that their initial influences were Vanilla Fudge and The Nice musically, and Simon and Garfunkel in terms of vocal harmonies. So I think that was a big influence in because Vanilla Fudge were the first to kind of turn like Motown songs into hard rock, that kind of thing, with a few Bach riffs thrown in. So that was an early influence.
Yeah, You Keep Me Hanging On was their big number.
And actually, the first gig they played with Bruford consisted of In the Midnight Hour, played for like 40 minutes. and the only two originals they had, which was Sweetness and Beyond and Before. I think that was
Yes, that was at the Rachel
time.
Macmillan College, Deptford.
I believe so. Yeah.
Do you all remember when Yes Years came out, the documentary?
Yes Years was hugely exciting.
I was going to say, wasn't that just a revelation when that came out? We'll stop the share for a second and talk about that, because sometimes it gets claustrophobic to look at album covers for hours on end.
So Yes Years was the first release I bought on CD. You know, my first few Yes albums were just on cassette. And I didn't even have a CD player, but this seems so huge, a full CD set. It was so exciting. I think now where your average King Crimson set is 20 discs, full CD seems nothing in comparison, but it seemed such a big thing. I thought, well, I'll get a CD player soon. I might as well get this on CD. And to have that wonderful a huge book in the middle with one of the Pete Frame family trees, where you could trace all of the history of the band, was gorgeous and helped make me a fan not just of the music but also of the convoluted history of Yes and prog more generally, all the interconnections between other bands.
Sure. And do you remember seeing the documentary that came with it, or was that later?
Actually, when you mentioned Yes Years, I was thinking of the documentary, because I've never actually owned the box set. For me, it's primarily the documentary with all the interviews that were filmed during the rehearsals for Union, and all the anecdotes that got repeated quite a lot over the next few documentaries, actually. So for me, this is probably the best, although it's missing Jeff Downes and Peter Banks and a couple of other guys. So it's not quite complete, but it's still my favorite, I think.
Yeah, it's mine too. I mean, the Union tour footage is awesome, and just getting a chance to kind of suss up the personalities of each guy by listening to them talk for a bit was a first. It was very enlightening. And then to see all that live footage over the years was fascinating. And it sent me on a 20-year quest to get all of that footage, and, this was in the early 90s. We were trading Yes things via handwritten lists and sending them through the mail, and somebody would send me a cassette. I was kind of determined to hear every live song that ever was played. I didn't want countless shows that were repetitive. I just wanted to hear how well they tackled each one of these. And the answer is quite well.
Yeah.
Because, it's like, go ahead.
Yeah, we have to remind younger viewers that this was well pre-YouTube. So we waited years before we could actually see the entire clips that we were shown excerpts of in the documentary. So there was, we weren't blasé about all this archive footage being available.
Not at all. I mean, going to the mailbox, it was like being an archaeologist and unearthing some treasure. I mean, nowadays you can find out all on YouTube, but back then it was just trickled in little by little, and it was, to watch these kind of 10th generation grainy videotapes over and over and just be, so happy, so yeah, that was kind of a special time, not to be repeated. But yeah, I would suggest that documentary for anybody that wants to hear the band's version of things up to Union. Yes Years is the way to go. And there's lots of great live footage in it as well. All righty, well, let me get back into the thing here. All right. So the next album is a little different because they had an orchestra on it, and it was called Time and a Word. And for some people, it's unnecessary, and other people like the orchestra. How do you guys feel about it?
I love the album as it is, but at the same time, it's different to what they were doing live, and you can see why Peter Banks wasn't happy about the use of the orchestra. It's a different vision of Yes to what they could be live, and I think what he wanted the band to be, and it represents more what John Anderson was trying to do with the band. So we're seeing these creative tensions. But often that's what makes Yes so successful is the different voices within the band pulling it in different directions, and producing something magical from the middle of all that.
Yeah. What do you think are the standout tracks on this particular album?
For me, it's the covers, really. I think No Opportunity Necessary and Everydays I really like. I think the use of the strings is quite successful. I mean, it's over the top, that's for sure. Certainly in No Opportunity Necessary, I mean, the intro is kind of over the top, but it's quite impressive as well. And that album also needs to be singled out as the birth of the Chris Squire bass sound. I mean, it started out as a mistake because the sound engineer had headphones that didn't work, and he pushed the bass up to make up for that. Didn't realize that he was pushing the bass higher than on any record ever released before. But that was how it came about, and Chris Squire loved it and kept that sound for the at least for the run of albums they did in the 70s.
Oh.
So that's quite important as well. So I think it's a failed experiment in a way, but it's still a very strong album.
Oh yeah. I would point out a few of the originals. Even in these early days, these songs were not very long, but they're packed with really interesting arrangements and parts that take you by surprise. And I think that's kind of the best prog songs are like that. Astral Traveler, I think, is a great one. Then is another one.
The Prophet is a
Prophet,
little,
I was going to say that's the one that gets overlooked the most, and it's a brilliant little journey. So and you got to really look at the way this rhythm section worked back then. They were fierce, articulate and fierce and fuzzy all at the same time. It's like Chris's most aggressive tone, I think, is probably on this record. Even on the next one, it's a little more refined and a little less hairy. So there's something kind of special. The rawness of the first Yes lineup is a beautiful thing. And I think it's important to point out Peter Banks. He was a really important part of the early Yes. And I think sometimes he doesn't get his due just because his tenure wasn't that long. He only was with them for a couple albums, and they aren't the most famous albums, so people probably don't think about him quite as often. But he's a brilliant guitarist, and it's interesting, but I hear some similarities. Like the change from Peter Banks to Steve Howe wasn't nearly as jarring as the change from Howe to Rabin stylistically. I think Banks and Howe had some common ground. Their love of the volume pedal, for starters, swelling into notes rather than hitting them directly. And just some of the jazzy underpinning. I mean, you hear I See You. I mean, that's some great jazzy playing from Peter. So I was curious if you all had any thoughts about Peter before we move on.
I think Henry got to know Peter, right?
I got to know Peter a little bit. And he was a marvelously creative player. And he was quite troubled in his later years. He could be paranoid. He had difficulty maintaining sort of relationships with other musicians such that, he could keep a band going. But everyone who worked with him, although they often found him frustrating, also found him endlessly creative in his playing through to the end. And Yes, for him was a long time ago, I think, and it wasn't a big part of his life. He'd gone on to do many other things, and he was in other musical ensembles for longer. And we have more recordings of Pete playing in other bands. Sure. But he still loved Yes. I mean, I think he could sometimes come across as being quite sort of anti the band, but that was just a certain sort of English cynicism and self-deprecation. I think he was proud of what the band had done, and had a long battle with various figures around royalties, and was very happy when he eventually got a significant back pay of royalties for Yes and Time in the Word.
Okay.
I think it's worth mentioning, of course, the band Flash, that got quite a bit of attention in its time and made 3 pretty good albums. Empire was the next project, but that was only released much later on in archival form. And more recently, there was a 3 CD set or 4 CD set of all the Empire material.
3 CD set.
Yeah, so that's put it in the best possible setting, and there's quite a lot of good stuff in there. Even Phil Collins is on it.
Yeah, I'd say that Pete did quite a bit of good stuff after Yes, you know, like you mentioned, Flash for sure, and some solo albums. That Two Sides of Peter Banks is a pretty cool album, and he has Jan Ackerman from Focus on that album with him. So
and Steve Hackett and John Wetton.
Yes,
and Phil Collins. Yeah.
Yes, it's quite the lineup. So, you know, he continued to do great stuff after Yes. So check it out, folks. There's lots of good music out there.
And I think the thing to remember about the transition from Pete to Steve Howe is that Steve Howe joins the band as Time in the Word is being released. So Steve is, which is why he's on this US cover, because they reject the UK cover for being too risque. And they're like, quick, we need a band photo. And by this point, Steve had joined the band. But that means Steve's initial period in the band is touring Time in a Word.
Well, not exactly, though, because when he joined, they started writing the Yes album before they resumed gigs. And I'm not sure how much of the Time in a Word they actually played live, apart from the usual Everydays and Astral Traveler and a couple of others.
Yeah, they move on in set lists, and there isn't really an album tour in the way there is a few years later. They're still just gigging.
Yeah, and actually, there was a sort of a special gig with an orchestra before Pete Banks left, but that turned out to be a long time before the album actually came out, which it would have been more appropriate for the album release to do that gig, but it turned out to be...
But there's still some material in that set list where Howe is stepping into Banks's shoes before they start playing a lot of the Yes album material.
Yeah, like the Rascals cover and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, It's Love.
Yeah.
So I think that puts him in a slightly different position than, say, when Rick Wakeman joins the band after they've already started writing Fragile, whereby I think he was more exposed to the Pete Banks canon of Yes, and I think that influenced his approach, perhaps. And Howe has always been very positive about the Time in the Word music, I think.
Yeah, I think he respects that era, you know, and has been known to play some of it, even in recent years when they broke out Survival. That was very surprising. Or the recent live album that just came out from the Royal Affair tour, where they did No Opportunity Necessary. So, you know, yeah, he plays that stuff occasionally. So tell us a bit about the change from Peter to Steve and how they found Steve.
Well, both John and Chris had seen Steve. Chris was familiar with Steve from '67 when they used to play in underground clubs. Chris with The Sin, and Steve was in Tomorrow. At the time, great things were hoped for Tomorrow. It turned out they broke up before they released their album, but they were really a great big hope at the time. They were pretty exposed in the media. Yeah, they got a lot of attention. So Chris remembered Steve from that period. John Anderson had more recently seen Steve perform with Bodast, which was his next band, which was very, I was going to say very unsuccessful. I mean, very unlucky for sure, because they existed for about a year and a half and never got to release their album, which has been released since. I mean, it was released in the early 80s. It's quite tame, I think. I mean, I don't see how Bodast really had the potential to be a great band, certainly on account of their studio recordings. But apparently they were impressive enough live, or at least Steve was, that he impressed John Anderson to the point where when they thought of getting rid of Peter Banks, that was one of the guys they thought of. Although they seem to have asked Robert Fripp before that, because Fripp was asked. He got a visit from Bill Bruford and Chris Squire while King Crimson were recording In the Wake of Poseidon. And only after Fripp turned them down did they ask Steve Howe.
That would have been very different had he said
Yeah.
yes.
The King Crimson were clearly a huge influence on the band. Yes, begin earlier than Crimson, but they're very impressed by the In the Court of the Crimson King lineup, and that encourages them to work harder, practice harder, and maybe also to move on to writing more of their own material.
Yeah, well, I remember the story of them seeing the first King Crimson and John going, "Chris, we've got to practice a lot more." You know, so that's an interesting tale. Okay, so out, Peter Banks is out, Steve Howe is in, and we move on to this next lineup, which was the second lineup that produced the Yes album, which is their third album. And am I right that this was one of those ones where a lot of rock bands back in the day would retreat to some house in the country and commune together and collaborate? Not unlike
Yeah.
Led Zeppelin at Headley Grange or, some of those other bands.
Well, I'd rather make the comparison with Traffic, because Traffic were the ones who invented the getting it together in the country concept.
Mhm.
And that was before they made a gig or an album. Led Zeppelin retired to the country later in their career, actually.
True.
I think they started touring immediately after they formed. So that lineup of Yes was more like Traffic in that sense, because they went for a few weeks to the house Steve actually still lives in. I mean, he later bought it, the house where they wrote much of the Yes album. So they went off the road for a few weeks in the spring of '70 and wrote all this new material and rehearsed a set list that also included their cover of America.
Yeah.
And that was another new thing that from when Steve joined.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that song because I think that's maybe their greatest cover in some ways, and one that is changed and so far from removed from what the original was. I mean, it's almost like they took the lyrics and the melodies and dropped them onto a really progressive rockabilly inspired Yes song. That
a lot of it is really their own composition.
Yeah, it really is their own thing, I think. I played it for some Simon and Garfunkel fans, and they didn't even know what they were listening to until the lyrics came in. So,
And if you look at the writing credits on the new live album, it's even now split. So there's a section which is credited to Steve Howe.
Okay, well, I think that's fair enough because it's a tour de force for him. And the idea of country prog is a bizarre one, but I'd say it came alive in this particular song because it's lots of happy majory licks that are rockabilly meets kind of bluegrass almost, and it's beautiful. I think it's one of Howe's greatest moments. It's a tour de force for him, but
we also know that bits of the Yes album do date back a bit further.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, Starship Trooper is kind of a Frankenstein that was welded together with the middle section had already been around.
For everyone.
Yeah, and then Worm was part of a tune called Nether Street from Steve's previous band, Bodast. And I think it works much better in Starship Trooper. So it's
So for everyone is this tune they used to have, which has this sort of opening section that seems to have been by John, then Disillusion, and then it goes back into it revisits the opening section, but in a sort of more of a jam. And so you can see the structure is also kept. So they change the beginning bit, they keep the middle, Disillusion, and they stick on Worm, which is, yes, this riff that Steve had from Bodast.
And what's interesting is that it turned out to be a sort of warhorse for Yes live, but initially they didn't play it at all. They didn't think it had that much potential. And I think I read a quote by Steve Howe describing how they put it together in the studio as a sort of, as you said, a Frankenstein's monster kind of thing. And I think they kept the notion in mind that it was sort of an artificial kind of filler song, and they didn't realize immediately how good it was. And only after both Wakeman and Alan White had joined did they actually begin to play it live. So it's quite surprising.
Well, there's a certain tension and release with that Worm section that really is great live. And, the 80s lineup in particular really milked that. It's interesting how a Howe-driven composition became the centerpiece of the 90125 live experience. It's like they stretched Worm out for about 15 minutes at the end of the show back then.
Well, ultimately, it's a 3-chord riff, so it's like a rock and roll meme kind of thing.
Well, it's almost
it can work with any band.
Well, it reminds me of Freebird from Led Zeppelin, from Lynyrd Skynyrd. They're both in G, and you can almost play the same licks over them. So it's kind of like Yes's Freebird, I would say.
Yeah. With Squire soloing all over it.
Yeah, well, all the better. Okay, and their live shows, like you said, they were working in. Once they got to the Yes album, they would you say they played most of it live? Well, the big ones: Yours Is No Disgrace, Perpetual Change, I've Seen All Good People. I think
Henry, do you know more than I do about Adventure being a sort of related to the unreleased, unheard bass adventure with Steve and Chris on bass? That was a number we don't actually know.
Yeah,
it's still all mysterious. That there's this reference to Bass Odyssey or Adventure, which seems possibly to have been an early version of Adventure, but it's not clear, and we don't have. Or I don't know of any extant recordings of this piece in its earlier form.
Yeah, I wondered about that. There's a picture of Steve, and it's like he's just playing Chris's extra bass for that particular tune. So
Adventure is the only piece on the album that wasn't ever played, apart from recently when they did the entire album. Other than that, as I said, Starship Trooper, they didn't perform it until The Rainbow in '72, which is why the version on the Yes Songs album is practically the first time they ever played it, and Anderson doesn't remember the lyrics quite correctly. But other than that, Yours Is No Disgrace, I've Seen All Good People, and Perpetual Change became war horses for the live.
So there's still some disconnect between the studio band and the live band, and they're still playing some of these covers live.
Very interesting. Okay. Well, this became, their first classic, and, I think they named it well because it really summed up what I think a lot of us look for in Yes. And I think Tony Kaye, I don't think he gets quite enough credit, I know Rick is obviously the best known of the Yes keyboardists, but every one of them had a big impact on their sound when they came along. And that gritty Hammond organ that Tony had just cut like a knife. It was so edgy and rock. So that's really the hallmark of the early Yes sound, which I think Jeff Downes made an attempt to return to a bit on some things on Drama. Some of these big suspended held chords, not unlike yesterday a morning came a smile upon you, that kind of thing. It's just these big slabs of chords with a Leslie rolling away in the background. That's early Yes for me.
Yeah, your interview with Jeff Downes, you mentioned how that bit in Machine Messiah harked back to the same chord, same kind of chord in yours.
Yeah, the
Grace, yeah.
cables that carry the light to the cities we build. Yeah, that bit. Yeah. So
Yeah, so I think Tony Kaye is the superior Hammond organ player. Of course, Rick did this wonderful solo in Roundabout, but other than that, his forte was really piano and Moog. I mean, the kind of instruments that Tony Kaye rarely played, but Tony Kaye had a unique feel for the Hammond, I think.
Oh yeah, he did, and he just had the best tone. I mean, Rick's Hammond tone was much more polite in comparison, but it worked in context. But yeah, so that kind of leads into the reasoning behind them saying goodbye to Tony and getting Rick. Is they wanted an expanded palette when it came to.
Well, there's a bit of this sort of narrative that the early Yes are trading up, Pete Banks to Steve Howe, Tony Kaye to Rick Wakeman. And in interviews, they sort of often talk about musical differences being what leads to these lineup changes. But I'm not entirely convinced. I think musicians, when you ask them why people leave bands, they say musical differences, when often it's not musical differences. I think Tony Kaye, is it really that they feel he's not willing to explore these new keyboards, or is it more that they're not happy that he's off partying wildly? There seems to have been friction with Steve Howe on their US tour. He doesn't come back from that US tour at the same time as the rest of the band. He's off having too much fun. That hard partying lifestyle was that really why Kaye left, and personality confrontations with Pete Banks, is that why he left? It may be that other factors led to Banks and then Kaye going, and then the band had to find someone new, rather than this narrative that they've sometimes put out that they were on the lookout for someone new. Although, I mean, who knows? You get very conflicting stories from people.
Yeah, well, that's one of the challenges of having to write a biography of Yes, as I did, because you have to cross-check the facts from the various interviews, and in that case, it turns out that they seem to have secretly rehearsed with Wakeman in the interval that's just 1 week between their last US tour in New Haven and the last gig they did with Tony Kaye at the Crystal Palace. That's just 1 week apart. And apparently the audition with Rick was in that interval. And when they played Crystal Palace, there was an interesting episode where Brian Lane bragged about stealing Wakeman from the Straubs when, unbeknownst to him, a guy from A&M was in the dressing room and didn't know about Rick leaving the Straubs. And that created a bit of an incident. So that's one of the facts that I sort of unearthed to try and make clear what exactly had happened. And it turned out that Rick can only have been auditioned before Tony was out of the band, or even told that they didn't want him anymore. And the Fragile sessions happened within 3 weeks of that incident. So it all happened very, very fast.
You think Tony had a hand in writing that Fragile material?
He was clearly around when they're beginning to put it together. There was an interview in which Tony was asked about this, and he basically said he couldn't remember. He acknowledged that, yes, he remembers that they had started on the material when he was in the band, but he couldn't remember any details of what was happening.
Yeah, it was a long time ago.
Didn't Pete Banks make a claim that he had something to do with the riff of Roundabout?
Pete Banks said that he had showed John the chords for Roundabout, I think is what he said, which, isn't, the chords are just the chords. It's not a huge claim to having a lot of input to the song. But he did claim that, yeah. And no obvious reason not to believe him.
Okay. All right. So now Steve Howe is in tow, but Tony Kaye is the next member to be shown the door. And enter Rick Wakeman, the quintessential progressive rock keyboardist. And along with that, some fresh sounds. So we have our arguably third lineup, working on Fragile, which turned out to be, again, it's another cornerstone of the Yes sound. It's one of their greatest albums. There's 3 10-minute epics on it, mini epics, I guess you'd say, compared to what was coming soon. And then the solo spot for each one of the guys, like each guy did a solo spot. Now, as I understand it, Wakeman had some publishing issues, so he could not bring a original and have Yes record it, so he covered or did his version of Cans and Brahms. Is that right?
Yeah, it was forbidden by A&M to contribute an original to the album. In terms of his writing input, I think it's debatable whether, the way things were credited back then, whether he deserved a writing credit for whatever he did in Heart of the Sunrise, for instance. I think he would deserve a credit, certainly in light of what they did on later albums like Topographic Oceans or Relaire, when they credited everything to everyone, where in fact Moraz or Alan White, well, Alan White maybe a bit more, but they didn't necessarily have a lot to do with the composition work. In that case, Wakeman did bring some ideas, but he apparently both Roundabout and Heart of the Sunrise were already quite advanced in the writing stages. And I heard your most recent interview with Rick, where he claimed the piano riff or the piano theme in the middle of I can't
Outside.
Yeah, South Side of the Sky. So yeah, that's a major contribution as well. So perhaps he should have had a writing credit, but there was indeed an issue with A&M about letting him have credits in the compositions, although he's credited for Siberian Kutru, so that's not completely that strict, apparently.
Oh yeah, well, I imagine the harpsichord break alone was an original thing for him.
Yeah,
in that song.
It seems as though there may have been some arrangement by the time they get to Close to the Edge, such that Wakeman can have some credit.
Yeah, well,
the way Heart of the Sunrise, the story they tell is of Heart of the Sunrise existing in some form, and then Rick comes in and very rapidly, possibly even in his first rehearsal with the band, helps work out the arrangement for it. But that implies that the melody and the lyrics are all there. But yeah, Rick Wakeman is clearly bringing some new ingredients into the band.
Yeah, well, I think he understood about arranging on a different level than the rest of the band. So suddenly things start to get a little more ambitious and a little more tidy at the same time. He understood about capitulating and recapitulating and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't really see that in their work prior to that too much.
Yeah, and I think that's what appealed to him with Yes. He saw that he had a role to play in that respect. He'd done the multi-keyboard thing in the Straubs and got noticed quite a bit for that. He was the first, as he told you also in the recent interview, that he was the first to devise those keyboard stands for multiple keyboards. And that was what attracted attention and got him a Melody Maker headline or something as the next keyboard star. But what appealed to him in Yes is that he had all this great material that it could really be helpful in formalizing, because you had John Anderson bringing in melodies and Steve bringing basic ideas for compositions, and Steve had this, Chris had this orchestral mind as well, this grand vision, and Rick was able to bring the sort of music academy background to counterpoint and arrangement and harmony. So that was a match made in heaven, I think.
Yeah, well, it bore great fruit, definitely. So in some ways, this is the quintessential Yes album. I mean, if I was to just give somebody one Yes album, I would probably give them this one.
Can I ask Henry something?
Sure.
Because we seem to be in disagreement, because I would say practically that Art of the Sunrise is my favorite Yes piece. And I know that, Henry, I read that you didn't find the some of the keyboard arrangements for that really... I mean, you didn't like the keyboard arrangements as much as I do. Is that true? Is that correct?
I am less of a Rick Wakeman cheerleader than many a Yes fan. And I adore his work in South Side of the Sky or throughout Close to the Edge or Roundabout. But I don't like those fast runs he sticks in at the end of Heart of the Sunrise. They just come off as really cheesy to me. If I could, I'd just chop those all out. I realise this may be a minority view.
Yeah, I was quite surprised when I read that, because I think it's almost universally praised by Yes fans. So it's quite an original view to have on this piece. But I mean, I'm very accepting of dissenting views, so that's fine. I really love it.
There's so much great Yes music. We have to find some things to disagree on.
Yeah, so there's one.
All right.
But it's great to hear you talk very positively about Fragile Sean, because it often surprises me how some fans are relatively negative about it. The solo tracks often come in for criticism, whereas I think, while they're very different to Yes's long pieces, they're wonderful pieces in and of themselves. Even 5% for Nothing, short though it is a fantastic piece. We Have Heaven, Mood for a Day.
Well, there's some really interesting things going on with multi-tracking on this record, on those solo pieces. Like We Have Heaven is like a chorale of John Anderson's, vocally, and that was kind of different. And then Chris does the same sort of thing with The Fish, where it's several overdubs of bass melodies on top of each other. And then Chris, Steve turns in one of his finest nylon string pieces, Mood for a Day. The only other one that even comes close in the catalog, I think, is Leaves of Green from The Ancient, which I think is maybe his finest moment on the nylon string, but that's just my personal taste. 5% for Nothing is interesting. It's like, Yes has a very sunny approach to harmony. You seldom find flatted fifth intervals in their music, because it's, that's a very skronky sound that, King Crimson uses constantly. But, for Yes, that was kind of dark. And it's interesting that Bill writes a piece with a vocabulary that's more akin to King Crimson than Yes a few years before he winds up in King Crimson. Almost like he was thinking about King Crimson before he was even in it.
Well, I would describe this as more as avant-prog than, because Crimson is less composed for me than this is, because this is really scored for the entire band quite tightly. And I would think of this as a precursor to the avant-prog approach to composition, rather than reminding me of what he did with King Crimson, which was more about improvisation a lot of the time.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting piece of music, and I think, I just think it's wonderful. So, and I like Cans and Brahms as well. I think some people think it's a little cheesy, but I don't know. There's just something about the way this album flows from beginning to end that's very logical and satisfying. So, yes, I think it's one of their greatest. And the three epics are among their greatest arrangements, I think.
Yeah, it's easy to get tired of Roundabout, because the inevitable encore. But if you listen to the song, I mean, it's obvious how great it is and was, and how groundbreaking, and how it won them a lot of fans at the time. I mean, I
Absolutely.
remember Bill Martin's book where he described how that the bass line in that made him a fan for life. And yeah, that's really incredible. I mean, every member of Yes on that, it shines. It's a wonderful combination.
And I
And
should point out,
roundabout really significant for the birth of the Anderson Howe writing partnership. So Yes begins based around John and Chris writing together, and we still see that on Fragile with Heart of the Sunrise and South Side of the Sky. But Anderson and Howe then start writing together. We get Roundabout, and it's Anderson and Howe writing together that dominates the next 3, even 4 albums.
yeah, they had quite a good thing going there for a while. Also, I want to point out Long Distance Runaround. That's like the one short song that isn't a solo spot and has become a Yes classic.
Yeah, that's quite a great memory for me on the Union tour, because I was this old Yes fan that didn't really like the Yes West. So every member of Yes West that was on stage was a problem for me at the time. Of course, I've mellowed over the years, but there was this one moment in the concert where it was just that lineup, just those 5 guys from
Fragile lineup.
Fragile,
Yeah.
Close to the Edge. And John Anderson would tell this story before that he came to the studio with this very simple song, played it with acoustic guitar and vocals, and then mostly Rick, I think, arranged it into this weird progressive pop song, and it's quite wonderful and unique.
It really is. It almost has kind of a, I don't know, like a chamber music quality to it. I can almost see it being played on a harpsichord.
And
Hundreds
some
of
of John's best lyrics, Anger Melting to Stone, it's just wonderful imagery that shouldn't make sense and yet does make emotional sense.
Yeah. So yeah, I think this is a great place to start. If you're going to start with the '70s Yes album, this is probably the most. This or the Yes album, I suppose either one of those would be quite easy to digest compared to what's coming next, which is arguably the greatest progressive rock album ever. What do you guys think?
I often voted the greatest progressive rock album ever. I could easily agree. I think it defines the genre in many ways. There were plenty of times when I'd rather put on Drama or the Yes album or Fragile or 90125, but Close to the Edge is defines Yes for me, and yeah, I think in many ways does define progressive rock.
I think it all depends on what you think progressive rock is, whether it's a genre, whether it reached its peak or reached its pinnacle formally at this particular point. I mean, people often say that progressive rock should really keep progressing, so it should never be about finding the right ingredients or right recipe. But if you think of prog as a genre, I think Close to the Edge is pretty much perfection in that sense. Although the style kept moving on and into other branches, but in terms of the original course of progressive rock towards formal perfection, I think 1972 and that particular album marked a very significant milestone. And of course, for Yes personally, there was a sort of perfection in the way the personalities were combined to form this very unique and hard to classify music.
I think
And
that's
it comes right on the heels of Fragile.
same year.
An amazing period of creativity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and And just, I think, I wonder if they could have done this had Rick not been there. I have doubts because just the way it's arranged, side one, which is a 20-minute epic, the title track. Um, there's just a lot of hallmarks of almost classical arranging at times. There's theme and variation and things that I think they dabble with them, but they hadn't really jumped in with both feet. And this,
Yeah, I can't think of Tony Kaye doing this big church organ thing. I mean, it's so Rick.
yeah, and I don't know. I think Rick had a lot to do with the way this was arranged and why it comes off so successfully. And it doesn't really have that many parts. I mean, probably 5 or 6 themes that just come back in different keys and variations. Maybe less than that. I can think of shorter songs that have more pieces, actually. But whatever it is, the balance is just right on this one. And I think the opening section, "Seasons of Man," is one of the most aggressive and exotic things in the Yes catalog. Do you guys have any background on how that opening piece came to be?
Well, I would say that came out of their, I mean, in late 71, they toured America for the second time, first time with Rick, and they opened for the Mahavishnu Orchestra a couple of times.
Oh, there you go.
And I think there's definitely a trace of that in the opening instrumental before the actual song begins. So it's not strictly in the mold of Mahavishnu Orchestra, but certainly the aggressiveness of the song, of the sound. There's an element of that, surely.
And
Oh,
maybe also still some Crimson influence. I mean, I think you can hear this very strong Crimson influence in Heart of the Sunrise. But I think you can hear it here as well, perhaps.
yeah. Well, people have mentioned that the riff in Heart of the Sunrise was somewhat inspired by the riff in Schizoid Man.
Yeah. I think that's been acknowledged by Squire.
Yeah. Okay. I can see a connection there.
Heart of the Sunrise is, yes, doing Schizoid Man. And it comes out very differently because they're very different bands, but I think the influence is obvious there.
Yeah. Well, it's good in that case, when it's obvious, but not that obvious. So yeah, Close to the Edge, the first of many sidelong epics, arguably the greatest one. It's not my favorite. I think side one of Tales is my favorite. Though Close to the Edge is always satisfying. Though it became almost a little obvious in the last 20 years. They played it a lot, and it's interesting how they didn't touch it for such a long time. I think they probably played it last in 77 and then didn't touch it again until
ABWH.
Yeah, ABWH. Yeah,
They played a couple of times with on the Union tour. I don't think there's even any recording of that.
Yeah, it's true. I heard about
They did
that.
play it. Yeah.
Was it just the 5 guys that were on it? I can't imagine Raven.
I think from what I read on Forgotten Yesterdays, didn't they say that it was just the 5 guys? It seems almost like a made-up story. I can't quite believe it happened. But Henry, do you know more about that?
I have nothing useful to add. Yeah, it appears to have been played a few times. I think that is reliably reported. But you're right that it sort of doesn't take off again until later. And in recent years, it has become almost a staple. But I don't think you can complain at having Close to the Edge played too much.
Yeah.
It still works very well live.
Yeah.
I think there was the whole period when I think maybe 20 years when they didn't play any of the side-long epics, did they? I mean, the longest songs they played were usually from the Yes album throughout the 80s and stuff, and not until the Keys to Ascension thing. Apart from if you consider the Endless Dream suite to be a side-long epic, until the mid-90s they didn't play any of those side-long songs again.
Right. It wasn't really until 97 when they did it Close to the Edge on the Open Your Eyes tour that it really officially got trotted out. I mean, only a handful of people saw those 3 San Luis Obispo shows prior to that. So, although I have to say my favorite versions are from the 70s. there's a certain spark and tempo that I find appealing, and got kind of slowed down later on. I mean, it's still wonderful, and I know Chris had a way of dragging things out to try and make them more majestic, but I think the chaotic intensity of that opening section is important, and I've never really heard it since then. But
yeah, what you have to say too is that they never actually toured the album with the album lineup, because Bruford left before they played any of that album live, and that's an eternal source of frustration for me, because I'm a big Bruford fan, and I wish, because he offered to stay for at least a few gigs on the Close to the Edge tour, but they decided they wanted to replace him straight away rather than just have him do part of the tour. But I wish there'd been at least a few gigs with Bruford on drums, so we could have live recordings of that lineup playing Close to the Close to the Edge album in '72.
Agreed.
So they replaced Bill Bruford with Alan White straight away. And they made Bruford sign over half of his royalties for the album to Alan White. And there's this lovely story that has recently come out that Bruford in recent years wrote to Alan and said, hasn't this been going along for long enough? And Alan was like, sure, fine, have. So Bill Bruford now gets all the royalties again.
Oh, I figured it was the other way around. Bill was going to say, you've toured around the world playing it for decades. Here, take it all. So.
Well, that's his argument was he was happy for Alan to get that money for a while, and that it did contribute to the sale of this album by touring it. But Henry's point was that after 40 years, he thought Alan had enough of his money.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Gentlemen, I'm starting to think that we should do a part 2, because I don't see any way we could go through this whole catalog today without giving something the short end of the stick. So would you guys be interested in doing a part 2 sometime in December?
Sure. We're all going to be in a lot of COVID lockdown and unable to do anything else. Okay.
Well, then we'll do that. Then maybe we should go up through like drama today, and then we'll save the rest for later.
Yeah.
Sorry, folks, but if I do a 4-hour show, people will see it on YouTube and be scared to even click it.
It's never long enough for a Yes fan. I mean,
yeah, well, that's a good point. It's a good point. But moving on, side 2, 2 more of their 10-minute epics, 2 of the greatest ones. I arguably think Siberian Khatru is maybe the greatest Yes song in some ways. Any thoughts on that one?
I'm always annoyed when they play it at the beginning of concerts, because often the band takes a little bit of time to warm up.
Right.
And it's such a great song. I don't want it to be the song when they're still warming up.
Sure, I can understand that. There's so many cool parts. I think Bruford had something to do with a lot of the bits that are in that. And Steve Howe does. Steve Howe's how. One of the hallmarks of his guitar style back then was he'd take a lick and he would repeat it in different octaves. Like the opening lick to Close to the Edge, that little half a step kind of thing he does is a good example. And Siberian Khatru is another one. That gets higher and higher as he goes. And I think that's I don't see a lot of other rock guitar players sequencing things in octaves the way he did. I always thought that was a really
Machine Messiah is another.
Yeah, absolutely. And that song is a bitch to try and play. Just to try and jump around like that and you got to be on your game to play that one. Definitely. I had the pleasure of covering it a few years ago. I used to do a yearly prog rock night, and yeah, it was a treat to learn, but it was a lot of work to play. And yeah, you don't want to play that one if you had a couple drinks. You'll never make it. And You and I, of course, one of the greatest 10-minute mini epics, shows a more pastoral side of the band that would crop up here and there later on. How many times do you think they've played And You and I live?
I think only recently did they not play it. I mean, I think they played pretty much consistent. I mean, perhaps not always in the Rabin era. although they did didn't play it on the Talk Tour, for instance. But other than that, until very recently, I think it was an obligatory moment in a Yes show, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The wonderful Forgotten Yesterdays must have statistics on this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing that it doesn't quite reach 4 figures, but it might be getting close.
Yeah, say hundreds and hundreds of times. And it's interesting. I was asking John about how these songs evolved over the years, and he just alluded to they just got better and better, but I don't necessarily agree with that.
They did until a point, maybe, but yeah, it's presumptuous to argue that they continue to do so.
Right, just because you're older and wiser doesn't necessarily make the song any better, or the playing of it. I think it hits a wall at a certain point.
Yeah.
Although
but to return to the song, and you and I, what I like very much about it is the way it begins, like pretty much a man and a guitar, and you've got this Eddie Offord, Steve Howe exchange in the studio, where it sounds almost like you're a fly on the wall in the studio, and very intimate. And there's no way to anticipate that it's going to become this massive symphonic middle section. And there's a Stairway to Heaven kind of a crescendo there that is quite masterful, I think.
Oh, absolutely. And that middle section, it taps into a certain kind of vibe that didn't crop up a whole lot. I think Awaken is probably another one that certainly has a certain spiritually majestic vibe to it like that. And, that's sort of the intangible thing about Yes music. It's like, there's this kind of cosmic mojo that runs through it, and on a good night, you walk out of a Yes show feeling really elevated, like you saw more than just a rock concert. It was kind of a spiritual experience.
Yeah, and the entire album is actually about that. It's about becoming enlightened. I mean, it's not very clear always what is meant, but it's clearly about a man's journey to enlightenment. So I think it does show up in the music as well.
Yeah. And we know
you
that
have this classic example of Steve Howe writing a lyric down by a river because he had a house which was down by the river.
Okay.
And then John Anderson gets hold of it and turns it into a Buddhist metaphor, basically, drawing on things like Hermann Hesse's writing.
Very true. Very true.
So, yeah, Siddhartha is very much based around the river, and actually you hear the river at the beginning of the Close to the Edge suite. So it's not a straight interpretation of Siddhartha, much like Tales is not a full interpretation of the Indian philosophical principles, but there's a sort of that vibe in there, reinterpreted through Anderson's viewpoint.
If you read Siddhartha, and it's quite a short novel, which is this sort of retelling of Buddhist scripture. As when you come to it as a Yes man, it's striking because the language it places is so familiar. These phrases, these words jump out, and you go, "Oh, right, that's where it all came from."
Oh, interesting.
So you can see the influences again.
Yeah, I think I singled out a passage from Siddhartha in my Yes book in relation to the spiral aim that John Anderson talks about in his lyrics, and I found a passage of the novel that matches the notion of a man walking in spiral and elevating himself at the same time. There was an echo of that, definitely.
I think maybe any fan of this album would owe it to themselves to read that. Not that long, so
yeah,
look it up. Yeah, definitely. So at this point, Bill Bruford is ready to go. He's got King Crimson on his mind. They find Alan White, who they fancied, I think, because of his connection with John Lennon, being in the Plastic Ono band. That probably seemed really cool to get a drummer that played with a Beatle. You know, was that kind of part of the mindset, you think?
Well, yeah, but it was really through Eddie Offord, because Alan was a friend of Eddie Offord's, and they used to crash at Eddie's London pad when he was in town. Because Alan at the time worked with the band that he had on his solo album Ramshackled. Later on, there was a band going that never made an album at the time, but they were living in the country together, and a lot of the time Alan was playing gigs in London. He didn't want to drive back to wherever they were, and he used to sleep at Eddie Offord's place. And one day Eddie invited him to see the band record America at Vision Studios, and he saw them, and so that was his first contact with Yes, quite informal. And then later on, during the Close to the Edge sessions, Bill Bruford actually went to a secret meeting with Robert Fripp, I think. And Alan was there and was invited to sit in, and they played Siberian Cthulhu together. So that's more or less how it happened. And then later on, when they decided Bill Bruford wouldn't do any of the tour, because as I said, Bruford offered to do at least an early leg of the tour, but they'd rather have a new drummer join immediately. And they called Alan, who was, I think, playing with Joe Cocker in Italy or something. And they summoned him to London, and he only had 3 or 4 days to learn the entire set before they flew to America.
Yeah, very, very true. And you know, it's interesting that Bruford was the first one to leave of his own accord. You know, that was different for them, and I'm sure they.
Well, Bruford was a jazz fan, and I think in his mind to have been in the band already 4 years was much longer than his jazz ethos would accept, and he
Very
thought
true. Well,
he needed to work with other people, because being in a progressive rock band was a very exclusive thing. I don't think Bruford played with anyone during his tenure with Yes, so he wanted a bit of fresh air and thought
yeah,
Yes had exhausted their potential as he saw it.
you know, that's understandable. And you know, I think in the long run he made the right choice. And in a way, I think Alan was the right choice for them for the area that they were moving into. You know, playing these big arenas and stuff. Alan's more simple style, I think, probably connected better in that context and gave them a bit of a rock and roll kind of heft that I think Bruford's 5-piece jazzy style just wouldn't have quite been as powerful in those arenas and such.
I think Alan's a more varied player than he's sometimes taken for. I mean, he's playing in a lot of bands before he joins Yes. He's doing lots of sessions. He's doing lots of live work that hasn't left any studio recordings. But he's playing with jazzier bands. He's playing with rockier bands. He's playing with more experimental bands. So he's got a range to him when he joins. He's not just the guy who plays on Imagine.
No, and I think his Ramshackled album is a good example of some of the different styles he could do. I mean, a lot of those grooves are Latin inspired and not a far cry from Santana. And you know, that's not easy stuff to do. So I think sometimes he gets the short end of the stick because he replaced Bruford, but you know, he had so much more going for him, like you said. So I think he was the right choice in the long run.
And certainly his performance on Yes songs was quite impressive. I mean, the band was on fire, and he was very much a part of that.
Absolutely, and he kept up just fine.
Yeah.
So it's funny that Bruford left. You know, Bruford left because he basically said he wasn't in the business of pulling the same rabbit out of the same hat every night and reproducing what was on the record, which is understandable. You know, Yes was never a band that just got up there and improvised like King Crimson did. You know, there were sometimes.
Well, they were back in '68.
Yeah, early on, but yeah,
but that had long gone.
By '72, they were reaching a point where they were just expected to kind of reproduce the record to some degree. And
it also sounds like Bruford was somewhat exhausted by the making of Close to the Edge. This quite intense relatively long process. Although relatively long for the time, it was still made pretty quickly compared to the speed with which our favorite bands often make albums these days.
Yeah, it's not. It wasn't quite as long as Bruford says it was in his book.
It probably
Because I
just
think
felt like it.
he says 4 months, and it's not longer than a month and a half actual recording, which is long. But I mean, he's comparing it to Simon and Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water, which took about a year, and that's nowhere near as long. But in terms of Bruford leaving Yes to join King Crimson, I think a major factor was Robert Fripp telling him that you're ready to join King Crimson, Bill, because it was a long time dream of Bruford to be asked to join King Crimson, and apparently Fripp didn't think he was good enough or creative enough until he asked him in '72 when they played in Boston. There was a concert with Yes and King Crimson sharing the bill, which ended up being Bill's last gig with King Crimson. And Fripp told him backstage that he thought at last he was ready. So I'm not sure if Bill would have left of his own accord at that time unless he'd got a request from someone like Fripp to join his band.
Well, it's kind of interesting that, he left for more avant waters, and Yes kind of headed in a more avant direction themselves. I mean, like the first half of side 3 of Tales is some of the most whack out there stuff they ever did. And that continues on Relayer. And I sometimes wonder what Bill could have done had he stuck around, because I think some of that music was up his alley, even though he didn't realize it was coming.
Yeah, I mean, there's an outtake on Fragile that has a bit of topographic material in it called Old Fighters Past.
Oh, yeah, it's wonderful.
And contrary to what Bruford sometimes says, he did keep in touch with Yes. I mean, he's claimed that he'd never heard any of the things that they did after he left, but I know for a fact that he went to see them in '77. I think he even went to see them twice when they played Wembley. So he did keep in touch, and it would be interesting to have a contemporary account of what their discussion was on that night, because when writing about it retrospectively, Bruford is a bit more dismissive about all that than he probably was at the time, I think.
That makes sense. So anyhow, this is the end of a 3-album run that is often considered the holy trinity of Yes. And I could see that, because the next album was definitely a different thing. It's kind of like they took side 1 of Close to the Edge and decided to do it ×4, and out of that came arguably one of the most notorious albums in the progressive rock canon. If a double album, 4 sides, 4 songs that are each 20 minutes long, that probably seemed like overkill. And we often get the cry, oh, it should have just been a double or single. But, I like it just the way it is, and I can't imagine taking anything away from it. But, this was a difficult one, and basically one that Rick was not on board with, even though he did some great playing on it.
Yeah, and he also, like Bruford, he tends to rewrite history a bit, because there's this famous interview, not that famous, but I actually saw it on YouTube recently. I only knew about it from press article at the time, when they played the Madison Square Gardens in '74 on the Tales tour. Wakeman said it was the best gig he'd ever played with Yes, and it was just the perfect gig. And it's hard to reconcile that with the notion that he struggled through all that album, like hating playing it night after night. So I don't think it was that negative until after he left. So a bit of revisionist history there as well. Although, I mean, it's a fact that he probably didn't enjoy it as much as he enjoyed making the previous 2 albums. And I think also it was due to the writing process, because in a way, the circumstances in which he arrived in Yes were ideal, because the material for Fragile was more or less written, and it just required that final touch that he brought. And when they wrote Tales, he had to struggle through the whole writing process, which with Yes was always a bit
Laborious.
difficult, laborious. That's the exact word.
Yeah. Well,
and I think he didn't enjoy that. He would have rather done the same thing, arriving at the very end to add his touch, which is kind of what he did later on things like Keys to Ascension.
in
He
most
had them
cases,
right
remember
there.
the interview I had with him, I said, it seems like you seldom bring an entire piece to the band. You're more like the guy that ices the cake after the fact. And he agreed with that, And, so.
But as far as Tales, my own view, my own personal approach to it is that if I view it with a critical mind, I have many things to say about it, not being the perfect album and being too long or whatever. But then the other aspect of it is wanting to immerse myself in it, listen to the whole thing, and it's a completely enjoyable experience. So sometimes it's best to leave your critical mind aside a bit and enjoy it for what it is. But of course, if I have to write about it as I did in my book, I find arguments to say that it's not the perfect album, but in a way it doesn't matter that much.
Oh, I think it's perfect for what it is. And it is kind of a tough one to approach. I think I owned it for a few years before it really clicked with me. It's almost like I think I had to get tired of the previous albums, and then I was itching for a fresh dose of 70s Yes, and then I could take it on its own merits. And yeah, I just think side one is one of their nicest epics, and it's one that isn't played very often, so that makes it all the more special. Like I've seen 10 Close to the Edges for every Revealing Science I've seen, you know.
Yeah, that was the high point of the Open Your Eyes tour. Certainly it made up for the album being what it was. I mean, the tour, much like Union, the tour was great.
Right.
Which I remember some friends of mine wanted to go to see the Union tour and decided against going to see it because of the album, and they were very wrong to do that. And
Yeah,
I think
hardly
people
paid
who have missed the Open Your Eyes tour on the basis of the album were very wrong as well, because the tour ended up being mostly, I mean, practically only other stuff. I mean, apart from a couple of songs.
True. Little did they know that the band didn't like the album any better than they did.
Except Billy.
Maybe worse. Yeah, well, he was just glad to be on one. So yeah, Tales,
There's another mystery about Tales, I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Henry.
Which is the Dan Hedges Yes biography that came out in 1981, which is almost impossible to find these days. I don't have a copy, but I managed to read a copy, and it alludes to John and Chris having a major falling out before Tales, which isn't something that is described in other sources, but there's no reason to suspect that Hedges has made something up. He was close to Chris Squire, at least I think, when he was writing that book. And there is, I think, a continuing shift where Tales is very much John and Steve's vision of Yes. So what was Chris feeling? Because, maybe it's not just Rick who's feeling this is the wrong direction. And Chris was for a long time very critical as well of the album being too long in some ways, or at least too long for a live
Cut it out, maybe. Much like perhaps he had a similar point of view to what Rick was thought about it, is that there was too much filler material and it didn't feel right to expand it to a double album. Maybe I think that was probably the core of the disagreement there.
Oh, well, I think, there were some long stretches where there was some padding, I guess, Mellotron pads and such, where you're just kind of holding a chord. But I love it. I don't mind that, I understand Alan actually wrote some of those segments,
Well,
Alan,
he certainly wrote the end song, apparently, and he even plays piano on it, I think. the final song on Ritual.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I think side two is maybe their most overlooked epic. The Remembering. It's like people don't seem to remember it, but they should because I think it's got some of the most beautiful playing. Steve does a lot of cool 12 string on the relayer, all the dying cry before you, that section. And then Chris is playing fretless bass, which is kind of different for him. And that whole don the cap and close your eyes section is just like one of the greatest acoustic moments in the Yes catalog. I mean, wow. I actually took that piece and stuck it on a mixtape one time, just kind of out of context. That little section there, it works beautifully.
I'm sure
So
you're aware of the bass player on YouTube who did a whole video of the Remembering playing all the bass over it.
I
I can't remember the name of the guy, but it's fantastic because he does it.
Sid
He
Miguel.
nails it. Yeah, that's right.
yeah
I love this video.
yeah, I just don't think this one gets enough love. And then
Yeah,
the first half of the Ancient with the crazy slide guitar,
yeah.
that's like the weirdest moment in the Yes catalog, I think. But it's wonderful, and I love the marimba. That's kind of rumbling underneath it all. I can't scat that one. It's a little tricky, but you know the part I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just wonderful. And then one of Steve's greatest nylon string pieces at the end. Leaves are green, just superb. So yeah, there's a lot to love on this record. And then Ritual, of course, is like they said, driving it home on a biggie, and it definitely has kind of some of the themes that you heard earlier on the album.
Yeah, some of the percussion stuff is a bit long when you only listen to the album, but it worked great live. I mean,
Yeah,
the whole
live it was
percussion thing
definitely.
where they all played percussion.
Yeah.
That's great. But it's sometimes, I mean, initially when you hear it on album, you wonder what's going on, and it makes complete sense when you see them actually do it.
So it gets back to this idea of Yes music as a spiritual experience. I mean, it's called ritual, and it almost is a ritual. And Ed McCann, in his writings on progressive rock, talks about the progressive rock concert as a sort of secular alternative to a religious ceremony, and ritual fits that description.
I could see that. I mean, even on the 90125 tour, John just seemed like I felt like I had seen a rock and roll evangelist, like he's all in white, just gleaming like an angel down there. And it just lets off this cosmic mojo that just kind of transcends a rock concert. It's wonderful,
Well,
actually.
it's his voice, his tone of voice as well, that is so not rock and roll in a way, and it clearly is about something else than just girls and fast cars and yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And it's just, yeah, I mean, just love it. And he's still got that magic all these years later. I think, no matter, I think Yes kind of goes with him wherever he goes, even if it isn't called Yes at the time. Um, Not to say that he's the embodiment of it alone. He's definitely not, but he's a big part of it. So Tails, I should mention that, their staging and their live show started to expand and grow. Previous to this, About as Good as It got was your typical blobs of ink bubbling on a hot light bulb, kind of psychedelic kind of background like every psych band had in the 60s. But when they reached this tour, they started building some different props. They have this crazy looking thing that lights up that sort of looks like some coral at the bottom of the ocean or something. So suddenly it was starting to be kind of a visual extravaganza as well as a musical one.
I think it's easy to forget how commercially successful the band has become by this point. So they're doing huge shows. Tales is a #1 album in the UK, although arguably that reflects the success and popularity of Close to the Edge more.
Right.
But yeah, they've become this huge band. They are interested in putting on a significant show. we're entering the era where Emerson, Lake and Palmer each have their own gigantic truck. You know, I don't think each member of Yes got their own truck, but we're entering the same sort of large scale events.
Yeah. And we have barely mentioned Roger Dean so far. So
Yeah,
we're
we
looking at one of his finest works. And of course, the staging of the shows was very much Roger and his brother, Martin Dean. I think Martin was actually even more involved in the stage props than Yes were. And going back to Emerson, Lake and Palmer, I think the whole Prague show thing got going when they started playing stadiums, and they didn't have giant screens on the side of the stage at that time, so they had to find ways of making a show that was visible even for the people at the back. So they started having these fireworks and stuff, and the Yes version of that was all these plastic forms that with lights in them that blinked or with smoke, and a show that was very much visible for the people at the back as well.
Yeah, I would say that whole show really peaked with, you know, the Relayer tour and the one that followed it. By the time they got to going for the one, they were already starting to kind of strip it back a bit and make it a little more streamlined, I think. But
and they started having those films as well on the Going for the One.
Oh, really? That's right.
Turn of the century. That's why they had these white gaze backdrops at the time. So yeah, the Roger Dean thing was very much scaled back. In fact, they weren't. I mean, Dean was no longer involved at that stage with Yes, because they had this falling out before the Going for the One cover design. But
yeah,
I'm going a bit ahead of time there.
Right. But yeah, that whole arena era, their show got very elaborate. You know, the Tails one though was like the first one, and then Relayer even more so. And then like, was it the solo album tour that they did after that, where they had this thing that looked like a Hydra, where it had like, you know, it's like this crazy lighting globular looking thing.
I think it was already at least on the 75 tour in England, or at the QPR.
Okay.
I think they already had that, didn't they?
Yeah, I actually put together a presentation of how the staging changed, but I know this is going to be a long enough show anyway, so I'm not going to dip into that. But it was kind of fun to try and find a picture of every stage from every tour. It took me a couple days to dig around and find them. It's interesting how it evolved and then devolved. You know, changing with the times, though. I mean, you know, the 80s.
Yeah, well, as I said, there was a kind of falling out with Roger Dean around 76, 77, and so that put an end to this particular era, although they worked with him again for drama.
Yeah, you know, I can't help but think that Going for the One in Tormato would have been better received if they had Roger Dean covers.
Probably, yeah.
You know, I mean, they still did okay anyway, but the whole Hypnosis was not a good fit for them. And I think those are two of the worst covers Hypnosis did for anybody.
Yeah.
You know, Pink Floyd, they did amazing work. Yes, I don't think it was a good fit, but it was kind of the time, and I don't blame them for trying to change it up. Or maybe it was just they didn't have Roger available at that point anyway, so they had to.
Well, they had, I mean, Roger offered a design for Going for the One, but John had other ideas. So it's not like it wasn't Roger's doing that he didn't participate.
They were ready for something different anyway.
I guess.
Okay, so Rick is out of there. He had enough. He thought he left because this album was too pretentious. So he went.
No. He left because his own album was very successful. It was getting to number one. Well, he had a solo career on the rise. So that was the rationale after the fact, that he hated that album so much, but it wasn't so clear cut, I don't think.
Okay. Because what I heard was basically, you know, it's funny how he left over something he thought was pretentious and then turned around and did King Arthur on Ice.
Yes.
Oh, the irony.
Yeah.
Yeah. With the inflatables that deflated during the show and all that. It's pretty funny stuff, actually. So anyway,
the ice skaters as well. I saw that recently.
Yeah.
The King Arthur on Ice. That was, I mean,
so
very Spinal Tap-esque.
Rick out of the picture enabled them to bring in Swiss
Vangelis.
keyboardist.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. He was the first one that came along,
Yeah.
Vangelis. Yeah, and he wasn't a good fit.
He
So
was in some ways, but his personality was wrong. I mean, Vangelis was clearly a solo artist rather than a group member, and also he was against flying. So immediately, yes, had reservations about having him. So it wasn't like it was the totally wrong idea. It worked for a while, about 3 weeks, I think.
And John and Vangelis formed this friendship that lasts for several albums through to into the 80s.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, well,
and of course they also try out multiple other keyboardists before they get to Patrick Moraz. I mean,
anyone famous?
Well, Eddie Jobson was asked. I think Jean Roussel of Cat Stevens was asked, and Nick Glennie-Smith of Wally was the guy who was actually going to replace them until I think Brian Lane suggested Patrick Moraz as the guy they really needed to get. And Patrick Moraz was actually in the middle of promoting the Refugee album. So it wasn't like he was really available, but it was too tempting an offer to refuse. So he dissolved Refugee in the middle of the tour.
Well, I think he was the right guy for the job and the direction. I have to admit, when I first heard live versions of him playing Rick's stuff, I didn't like it. I'm still not crazy about it, but it depends on the song. Like songs like Ritual, he nailed it.
Yeah.
But other ones, even like And You and I, some of the melodies in there, it's like, oh, you can't change that. That's not right. But in hindsight,
there were tuning issues with the Moogs as well.
In hindsight, I've grown to really love everything that Patrick contributed, and I think he was the right guy. Had Rick stuck around, this album would not have been the same. Baroque arpeggios are nice, but every once in a while it's nice to hear a different approach. And Patrick was very different, and he brought in some different tones that Rick didn't favor also. The ARP string ensemble and the Fender Rhodes piano.
Yeah, but what's interesting is that, I mean, if you listen to the Refugee album, it's pretty much a prog rock album rather than anything jazz rock. So it's quite interesting that not only did the jazz rock vibe of the album predate Patrick actually joining the band, I think, and also the instruments you mentioned appear to have been what Vangelis had brought to the rehearsal place they had. He had the Fender Rhodes, he had this string machine as well. And so it seems that Patrick ended up using those keyboards because Vangelis hadn't yet taken them back to Paris, where he was living at the time.
That is the story I heard. Like the intro to Sound Chaser wound up on Rhodes because that's all they had there at the time.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm glad it happened because, that's a texture and a sound that you really only heard in Canterbury, Prague.
Yeah.
Or
American jazz rock.
Right, exactly. Fusion. And it's a delicious sound. I love it whenever I hear it. So it was great to hear it in Yes, even briefly. And then just his Patrick's approach to the Moog, the way he used the pitch wheel to bend notes and stuff, reminded me more of people like Jan Hammer from Mahavishnu. His style was just totally fresh and unique, and I think it suited the material really well, because this is definitely Yes's the most out there they got. I think this was kind of the last album where they pushed the envelope, and Going for the One was a retreat to safer waters that were more familiar and accessible, and also having Rick back, of course, that all kind of went together. But I'm so glad they made Relayer. I think it's one of their most amazing records, and it's a challenging one at first to really absorb, but it's very rewarding. And the artwork that Roger did, this was basically just a pencil sketch that he colored in, but I think it's one of their most unique looking album covers.
I'd be interested in what Henry thinks of Relayer, because I'm exactly the right type of guy for this kind of album. Henry is more, I think, eclectic about his love for Yes. He loves the Yes West as well as all the other. So what do you think of Relayer ultimately?
I struggled for some years with Relayer to a bit, but I very much love it now. I think it's a terribly produced album, and I love good production. And we're also in a phase where Hal's guitar tone is very, don't know what the right word is, very squeaky.
Yeah, well, that's the Telecaster.
Yeah.
Yeah, very aggressive sound.
And I found that a barrier, but Sound Chaser is this. It is a marvelous piece of Yes music, and another example where, yes, you can hear somewhat where the influences are coming from, but it's still very much Yes music in its own thing. And To Be Over is another great piece, and Gates of Delirium is another one of these epics that, like Tales, is taking us on a long journey.
Yeah.
I do find Soon, which is often played separate, loses a lot of its impact when it's not at the end of Gates of Delirium.
I agree.
It that way.
Would you say that Steven Wilson's remix redeems the album a bit from a production standpoint? Because I used to hate the sound too, and I thought he made a good job of making it sound much better.
I like all the Steven Wilson remixes. I think, although sometimes I think it's not Wilson's skills as a remixer, often it's just the better technology of today means that going back to those individual tracks and then mixing them anew on modern tech just makes everything that little bit clearer. But yeah, I think he does a good job on Relay.
I think the best one he did was Tales. I think that turned out marvelously and needed it. I'm not quite as impressed with Relayer, but it is better. Yeah. Fragile, you cannot improve. It was pointless. I don't like the remix, and I don't like Roger's re-envisioning of the cover art either. But that's just my opinion.
You have to mention also that Relayer was recorded in Chris Squire's house. So it was a home studio in the making. So that might account for some of the what's wrong about the album sound. Although, if you go back to the individual tracks, I think the actual recording is not that bad. It's the mix and the mastering on the original release that failed a bit.
I think this was a peak for Alan as a drummer also. Yeah. You know, a lot of people only know him from the 80s, and they just think because that music is so simple that he's only capable of playing that way. And they don't give him his due. They just assume he's just, you know, a very simplistic player. But this album entails makes it quite clear that, you know, Alan was a formidable player in his own right.
As does Drummer, I think. I mean, Relayer and Drummer are my favorite Alan White albums with Yes.
Yeah. So he was really on a roll all through Drama. You know, I think there's some amazing drumming on these records. And no, it's not the Bruford jazzy, skittery type, but it's okay. There's many ways to be great. And Alan definitely had his own style in it. And there's some very technical drumming on these records.
I mean, his work on Sound Chaser and Ritual is complex, experimental, exciting, and fantastic performances.
Yeah, so people just, if they only heard the 80s stuff, they would never know. But yeah, he was awesome. Okay, so Relayer, yes, that's another one that is crafted like Close to the Edge. One side-long epic and 2 10-minute songs. It's almost a deliberate, similar contour. And it's fine. I think that was a good way to kind of back away from Tales and move on. Okay, so, of course, Brian Lane talks Rick Wakeman into coming back.
Well, first we've got the solo albums.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Let's talk about those. Yeah, let's do.
I mean, I think the solo albums are significant in many ways. Firstly, because because we had these almost Yes albums, and Fish Out of Water in particular stands out as everyone's favorite.
Yeah, Chris Squire's album.
With both Bill Bruford and Patrick Moraz guesting on it, although Moraz only on a bit of it. And Fish Out of Water is this sort of alternative universe version of what Yes music could be. And Elias the Sun Hillo from John is again almost this alternative version. But I think also it's important because it's significant because of this tension we've already seen with Rick Wakeman between what do you do in Yes and what can you do outside Yes. Before the solo albums, if John had an idea or Steve had an idea or Chris had an idea, their only outlet was Yes, and often it felt like the eclecticism of Yes music was because, you know, the principals were just shoving all of their ideas in there, whether or not you'd think that idea would work, it all got shoved in there. And then as they become more established as musicians, and Yes's fame allows them to step outside Yes, they start having options. They start having the option of going, ooh, well, I could do this idea on a solo album. I could do this idea on a John and Vangelis album. I could do this idea, you know, later on an Aja album. And I wonder whether that contributes to this shift some people say you start getting with Going for the One, where the band starts deliberately trying to sound like Yes in a way that they hadn't previously.
I think you've got a point. I can hear that. And that I should point out to our audience, in case you don't know, basically this was a time where the guys each decided to do a solo record. And, you know, and for many of them, it was their first one. And there were several to follow. You know, Steve did one called Beginnings, which was appropriately titled. And then Chris...
Isn't it everyone's first solo album?
I guess it was. Yeah, you're right. You know, so it's almost like, okay, Rick, if you can do that, so can we. And so they did. Patrick did one called The Story of I, which is a really interesting record. Can you guys talk about that one for a minute? It's got Brazilian rhythms, and it's a wild record.
I believe some of the proggier material on that was leftovers from Refugee that were going to be on the second album. But then he mixed that up with all this Brazilian percussion stuff that he started getting interested in as part of, I can't remember exactly, but he toured the world and certainly South America with some projects before Refugee. And that's when he fell in love with all the Brazilian music. And so the album became a mixture of that, all tied together by this rather obscure concept.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting one. And then Alan did the one called Ramshackled with his old band. And, you know, it's funny. The word on the street is always, oh, it sounds nothing like Yes. And I think for a lot of people, they just avoid it because they expect these solo albums to somehow give you a Yes-y feeling. And it's not that. Even the song that Steve and John guest on sounds more like something that could have been on Elias. It's kind of lightweight and new agey. I almost think Elias could be one of the first new age albums before the term was even coined. It's very much one where you just kind of sit back and let it kind of wash over you. Very relaxing piece of music. Everything on it.
It's a really brilliant album, and I think you really get a clear picture of what John and Chris brought to Yes in the most positive way, because I think they are both masterpieces in their own way. I think Steve Howe's album is more problematic because it probably shows more a weak side of Steve, which is singing, and the way his music is sometimes lacks form, lacks an accomplished form, and goes in several directions at once. Whereas Chris's album is very focused. It's got its own band, basically three people: Andrew Jackman on piano, Chris on bass and Bill Bruford on drums, with various guests helping out. But it's a very focused album, and John's album is very focused, of course, as well, and it's also based on the notion that he wanted to do everything himself. Being a non-instrumentalist, he did very well in this respect.
Yeah.
And it was a personal challenge as well as a
Although
laying
he
out
takes
of his inner musical world, which is still very impressive. And
Although he takes his time over it, he's the one who's still working on his album when the others are being released.
Yeah,
Okay.
and he's the one who actually delayed the whole solo album thing because it took much longer than planned to finish his album, and that set the band off in things didn't quite work out the way. I mean, a lot of time was wasted in those 2 years with Patrick Moraz, and a personal source of frustration for us Europeans, although I was too young at the time. But that lineup never toured Europe. They played a UK tour in '75, never played France or even Switzerland, where Patrick was from. So,
you've heard the rumors of Vangelis playing on Elias, but I don't hear anything particularly technical. I don't hear anything.
I think that Vangelis has denied it very strongly, and there's no reason for him to lie at this point.
Right.
And there's nothing on Elias that is technically difficult. Its magic is that it's multiple overdubs. It's the tracking that makes it work.
Right.
I don't think there's anything on it that is beyond Anderson's ability to perform.
Yeah.
Technically demanding.
And we know Anderson can play a number of instruments. He's not the virtuoso performer that his bandmates are, but he's certainly able to play keyboards and guitar, etc.
Sure. Yeah, I think so. And just another minute about our moment about Ramshackled. I think that one hangs together pretty well too, but it owes a lot more to like Chicago and Santana and maybe a little Zappa as well in some of the horn arrangements. Really surprised me. I picked up a copy of it just a week or two ago, and I'm amazed that I never heard it beyond The Silly Woman, which was you hear a little bit of in the
clip,
documentary. And I just thought, well, if that album's like that, I don't need that. But I'm sorry I waited. It's a wonderful record, and I'm really impressed with it.
But it's more like Alan is lending his name to a project. I mean, he doesn't contribute a single musical idea to it. I mean, the writing is all
just
done
some
by
great
the other
drumming.
guys. Yeah, so it's more like as I said, it was a band he had before. I mean, it's versions of Happy Magazine or bands he had in the late '60s. It's all based around these people, Colin Gibson and all these guys. And then so it's really him reforming his old band because he had studio time allotted by Atlantic to do it, and so it's released under his name, but it's really whatever the band. I mean, I can't remember what the band was called, but it's this band really.
So,
is it Griffin or is it before Griffin?
It was after. I mean, it's a variation of Griffin, but he's named it in an interview or another. I could find what it was named. It was a band that he had on the side while he was working with Joe Cocker and John Lennon.
And you're right that it's odd that he has no writing credits on the album, even though he has been writing bits of Tales and Topographic Oceans and Relay. He's got ideas. He's contributing composition to Yes, and yet he doesn't for his solo album.
Yeah,
we'll talk about Turn of the Century later on, and is very much the originator of that one.
Yeah, well, that's coming up, and so interesting. So Alan's is of the 5 solo albums, his really isn't a solo album in the same sense that the other 4 are, but that's okay. It's still, I think it's worthwhile checking out.
It's a bit like Nick Mason's Fictitious Sports album, which is really a Carla Bley album released under the name of Nick Mason.
Sure. And I will say, I think that the sound of Elias and the sound of Fish Out of Water informs the sound of Going for the One. Like, I think there's there's some kind of that new agey meets kind of pastoral kind of meets symphonic sound that I don't know. I hear kind of a connection.
Yeah, and there's the rockier aspect as well, because Parallel is a leftover from the writing sessions for A Fish Out of Water. So
Yeah. And
there's an
going for
echo
the
there as well.
one, just it seems like I said, it seemed like a retreat to more familiar Yes sounds, but it's different. I think it's a really regal album. It's just kind of has an aura to it that none of their other ones have. There's some of Steve's most beautiful nylon string work on there, and then Awaken is unlike any other epic that they did. It definitely goes some new places and it has the payoff in a different way. The way it
But there's
climaxes.
similarities though with Close to the Edge, for instance. I mean, the church organ middle section.
Good
I mean,
point.
it takes a completely different form ultimately, but there are similarities in the length and the way it's structured. But
Yeah.
of course, it ends up being a totally different thing.
I asked Rick if any of this stuff was written when Mraz was around, and he's like, "No, we wrote it all when I was in the church in Switzerland." But I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's not quite true because they played the beginning section on the. I mean, if you listen to the Reading Festival '75 concert, they play as a single track the High Vibration introduction.
Right.
And
Yeah.
apparently, that was very much a Mraz composition, which they ended up modifying a bit. But there's an alternate version of it on Mraz's Out in the Sun album. Whatever it's called, I can't remember, but it sounds very much like the same piece in a slightly different twist.
I mean, Howe has more or less admitted in one interview that Mraz deserved a writing credit for Awaken.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, the keyboard section in Awaken clearly comes from Wakeman. This is a song that's credited to Anderson Howe, but should really be credited to Anderson, Howe, Mraz, Wakeman.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, I think it's a tour de force for Rick and John. I think out of all the epics, those are the one they shine the most on it.
In your interview with Rick, he started out claiming the Cycle of Fifths was his, and then you sort of cited Steve's interview to the effect that it was really Steve, and I think the structure, the harmonic structure of the Cycle of Fifths is really Steve's idea. But of course, the end arrangement is so shaped by Wakeman to a very large extent, and of course, all the church organ runs in the slow section ended up being stuff that someone like Jeff Downes would quote note for note now because it's become part of the composition, really.
Oh, absolutely. And yeah, it's just it's such an interesting piece of music, and saying it in live context, it's really cool. I was surprised to see it on the Union tour. It's funny. I think I owned every 70s Yes album except for Going for the One, and I thought, well, what are the chances they're going to play something from that? Well, I went out and bought it the next day, and Awaken was quite impressive. My first time hearing it, only being live, it was, I didn't know quite what to think. It was amazing.
A favorite version of mine is a quite recent version John did with Todd Mobile.
Oh yeah,
a band from Iceland, I believe. It's a fantastic, incredible version. Look it up on YouTube. It's got a whole orchestra, and it's beautifully played and sung.
Yeah,
So,
John has mentioned that himself. He was quite impressed with it. That's an amazing orchestra that's played with a lot of other people.
Steve Hackett,
Todd Rundgren, I think, did some shows with them, among other people. So anyway, Mraz is out of there. They got Rick back. Any idea of did Brian Lane think, oh, that's the best lineup, it's more commercial, we could do more with it, Rick never should have left?
I mean, the real explanation, I mean, I'm not sure I have the entire story there, but Rick went bankrupt just before he rejoined Yes, and Brian was managing Rick as well as Yes. And Rick spent so much money on the production of his extravagant shows that he ended up having to dissolve his English rock ensemble. And that's when he tried, Brian Lane got him to team up with John Wetton and Bill Bruford, and that didn't work out because they couldn't find an arrangement with EG Records. Each label wanted the project for his own label. So that was killed in the bud, basically. And so the next possibility was to have Rick rejoin Yes. And it's still not absolutely clear what went on and why exactly Moraz left. Was it musically not working out? Was it a personal thing? Maybe a mixture of both, I don't know. In any case, it was in Brian's interest as a manager to forge a reunion of the two parties. And initially, Rick joined Yes in Switzerland as a session man, and he was then persuaded to rejoin as a full member.
I get the impression from interviews that it was a personality issue with Moraz, that they weren't getting on, and they found it difficult to get on. But hard to tell decades after what exactly happened.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lucky aspect of the English rock ensemble splitting up was that Chris Squire was able to buy his 3-neck bass from Roger Newell, who was Rick's bass player, and had this made to design for him. And Rick found it was the perfect way to play Awaken live. When in the studio, he did it with 3 different basses.
Yeah, that became quite a centerpiece live, and just seeing him with the triple neck, you knew what song was coming, and it was
harp as well. Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, it has a regular fretted neck, it has a fretless neck, and then it has kind of almost
an 8-string bass. Yeah.
Okay.
Like the bass equivalent of a 12-string guitar.
Yeah.
With each string doubled. So that's for the slow organ section.
Right. That
is the octaves or fifths. Yeah.
So that's a really impressive. Just to see him playing that was something else. Yeah. And then the title track, interesting tune, kind of rocking, but it's almost another country-inspired one, driven by Steve Howe, and it's the only one where he plays the lap steel all through the whole song. Usually Steve will throw a little dash of lap steel in, like in "And You and I," but here's a song that's written entirely on it, and I think that's unique in the Yes catalog. And it's a really high song that's hard to sing.
Yeah,
I know they
struggling with it.
Steve just mentioned in a recent interview that they lowered it down a step when they did it during the 90s and 2004, but it said it just was never quite the same. Just changing the keys of songs really does change their personalities. And sometimes it's tolerable and sometimes it's not.
We've talked a lot about Awaken, the last of the big epics of the 70s, but Going for the One suddenly has these other 4 short songs. And Going for the One structurally, seems much more traditional than anything the band had done since Fragile.
The song itself?
Yeah.
I agree. Yeah, it's got a pretty.
It's a rock and roll song, and the lyrics are about looking out the window and finding inspiration from real life rather than doing stuff like Topographic. It's very much a declaration that they turning a page after those crazy concept albums.
Yeah, very good point. And Turn of the Century, I just think that's one of the most beautiful songs in the Yes catalog. And like you said, it's one of the first ones where he told a story. The next album has another story song, Circus of Heaven, which is not quite as wonderfully revered.
Yeah,
I don't mind it.
The interesting thing is that John was finding it adventurous to do a song that told an actual story, where a regular songwriter would, the notion of being adventurous would be to try and do what John usually did. So it was a reverse situation where he experimented with a song that actually meant something in a straightforward manner.
I think John really started to come into his own as a live performer around this time too. You know, I think early on he was kind of shy and reserved, and like by the 80s he was quite extroverted on stage. You know, he really found his feet, I think. And
I have this vivid memory of my first Yes gig here in Grenoble on the Union tour, and John, at one point in the show, I remember, was very critical of how the town looked. He said it was a very ugly city.
oh,
So I was taken aback by his bluntness.
well, you
It's,
can't say he wasn't honest. just not very tactful.
yeah.
Well, sorry about that. So, any other thoughts about this album before we move on to the next one?
So I think there's some interesting references, indirect references Anderson has made, basically saying this is the album where cocaine comes in.
Oh, never thought about that.
You know, Yes were a band that used drugs. They were, you know, smoking plenty of cannabis, which clearly inspired a lot of those word salady lyrics on the Yes album onwards. But they're not a band that we think of as being a huge drug taking band in the same way that, you know, David Bowie's bands from the same time period are,
Sure.
which Tony Kaye's in for one tour, are all massively on everything going. But they are taking drugs, and Anderson has suggested that it was around here that cocaine comes in, and that might have been a factor in the sort of music they're making.
Yeah, that's a good point, because you have to notice how long it took them to record this. I mean, it took 6 months in Switzerland or something, and if you listen to the work in progress versions, I mean, it really seems to have been a very dragging, protracted process to get the songs to the brilliant final arrangement they have, where it would have taken them 3 weeks 5 years before. So the end result is really quite impressive, but it seems to have been a struggle to reach that point of perfection.
Well, I don't think the coke got in the way of the arrangements in this one. I think they were still able to take their time and really stretch out and let things happen.
I don't think there was a lot of coke. I think a lot of coke comes in the 80s.
Yeah, that's not surprising.
Yeah.
But if I was going to say that an album seemed like it was suffering from ADD, which might have been brought on by all that, it would be this one, the follow-up, which is maybe one of the most unusual album in the Yes catalog.
I know people for whom Tormato is their favorite Yes album. I think it's an album with a lot to love on it, but it is an album that is well represented by its cover. It is an odd mix. It is a mess at times. I think it's also interesting how we've talked about how the Anderson-Howe writing partnership is driving Yes through Close to the Edge, Tales, Relay, Awaken, but it's gone. Anderson and Howe, for reasons that have never been particularly clear, stopped writing together, really. We go back to Anderson and Squire writing together a bit with on the Silent Wings of Freedom. We see Rick contributing more as a writer. And yeah, we get something of a odd mix, but it's got some great material on it, on the Silent Wings of Freedom. I love Don't Kill the Whale.
I think this is...
Sorry, about the breakup of the Anderson-Howe partnership. I interviewed John, and he told me about the writing process for Awaken, and he said this thing about hearing Steve in his hotel room practicing the 5/4 section, the chanting section that follows the introduction. And it's my impression that John took that idea and worked it into a song. It was less of a, you know, the way they wrote Tales, which was in hotel rooms after gigs during their tour of Australia and the US in '73. They seem to have had those writing sessions in hotel rooms because they were really quite friendly and at the time, and their friendship was at its highest. And I think even Awaken was the result of John using ideas from Steve, but not them being in the same room actually.
As
So
we
the
see,
partnership had broken up. I mean, even To Be Over is a bit like this.
yeah, and as we see with ABWH, as we see with Keys to Ascension 2, we see Anderson takes Hal's ideas and then does something with them. So yeah, maybe that begins earlier.
Yeah,
That's interesting. Well, I will say about Tormato that no album sounds like it. There was a big change in their sonic palette. Rick was using the
Polymoog.
the Poly Moog, where you could, instead of, in the old days with the Moog, you could only play one note at a time. You couldn't play chords. A chord is, a cluster of notes. Unless, you had a couple Moogs and play with two hands at once. And suddenly he could play a whole chord with, on the Moog. But it's interesting. He took a lot of sounds that maybe wouldn't be considered lead synth sounds and used them anyway as lead synth sounds. And that's what makes this record sound kind of a little frilly and fluffy. And I don't know. It's hard to explain it, but I found his palette much more appealing in the early days when he only had a Mellotron, a piano, a Hammond, and a Moog. Like Fragile and Close to the Edge. I think those are just classic sounds that don't age. This album, though, is about a different palette, and I think it's very much of its time, but it's very unique in its own way. And it's interesting. I think musically they were taking some cues from things that were happening elsewhere with punk and such. Tunes like Release kind of have a bit of that attitude, or not. Yeah, that's the one. And I think that it's interesting how all these groups grappled with the oncoming 80s. Out of it came some really unusual records like this one, or
yeah, I mean, it was a
or
healthy.
something like that. It's like you kind of scratch your head a little bit, but looking back, you realize there's no other record in their catalog like this.
Yeah, it was a very experimental album. I think it was a healthy way of trying to do something different. Because if you take Going for the One, they took 6 months working on 5 songs. I mean, the outtakes are quite insignificant. This one they recorded practically a double album and took what they thought was the best bits, and there's a whole lot of additional material if you listen to the reissue. And so I think they try to experiment and push the envelope and try to reinvent themselves in a way that would be more compatible with radio airplay as it was changing at the time, with radio advertising dictating that songs had to be shorter for commercial breaks and stuff. And there's interviews of Steve Howe at the time making it very clear that they were under pressure to come up with shorter songs. So they tried to do that as creatively as they could. But as Rick Wakeman pointed out, there was a compatibility problem issue between him and Steve, and they tend to tread on each other's toes quite a lot on this album. There's too much going on between the guitars and especially the Polymoog.
Well, I think they became sparring partners in a way, matching each other note for note. And this album is the excess of that, whereas they used to really work in a complementary way earlier. But that makes with this album, the unique treat it is. And, it's probably the least highly regarded of the 70s albums, but it's still a wonderful record and very unique. And and this is the first time they'd written songs this short since, Time and a Word almost. But they managed to squeeze a lot of interesting stuff into these short songs, and that is something that would pretty much be gone when the 80s rolled around. The songs are still 5 minutes in the 80s, but they have about 3 parts tops, Well, meanwhile, something like, Future Times or Release has got like 10 parts crammed into one 5-minute space. And as a prog fan, I find that fun and exciting.
Yeah, I'd like to ask each of you what you think of Circus of Heaven ultimately, because I don't like the monologue. It's a bit, it's very cheesy.
Right.
But the actual song, the reggae feel, I actually, I think the melody is quite good. So I quite enjoy this song apart from the cheesy monologue bit. So
I like the monologue.
yeah,
What is the word twee?
yeah,
I think that just sums up the song. I don't dislike it. In context, it's short and over with pretty quickly.
yeah,
So, and I like Chris's bass line where he's
yeah.
outlining those major triads note by note as they're climbing up the neck. So it's a fun one. And we should point out his bass sound, which was very unique on this record. He went for this harmonized kind of auto wah kind of bass sound
Yeah,
that really makes this record unique,
yeah.
along with
Don't
the other
kill the
three.
whale, and
Yeah, this
of
kind of
course the
almost like that kind of auto wah, like guys like Jerry Garcia made popular, on guitar. Instead of hitting a wah wah pedal with your foot, it just automatically happens when you pick. And it's kind of a similar thing going with Chris. So yeah, there's nothing quite like Tormato. I'll say that for it. And I think it is worth investigating. I I mean, when I first bought it, I didn't know what to think. I took it home and played it, and it's like, this doesn't sound anything like Fragile. There was another one where I had to kind of come back to it later and warm up to it. Um, so at this point, tensions are running high. They've been hanging around together for a number of years. I think a lot of respect was kind of lost. And they reached a point where they went to do a follow-up to this record in Paris, and they were a divided camp. It was Rick and John writing songs that the other three didn't want to play, and Chris and Steve and Alan writing songs that John and Rick didn't want to play. And listening to the leftovers from it now, I think it's good that they abandoned it and that drama happened, because I think it would have been like Tormato #2, but not even as good.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
So again, there's a lot of talk of musical differences as the band splits, and there clearly were musical differences. There's an interview where there's a reference to John Anderson offering a song about a dentist. What this song was is not known and has been lost to history, sadly. But it's clearly a very different approach and style to what House, Squire and White want to do. But at the same time, there also seems to be other things going on. There seems to have been a big row about money, which they later made up over. But complaints around how band money is being spent by different band members and their wives. So it may have been, I think, again, as much about non-musical things as musical things pushing them apart.
Sure.
But clearly, I mean, I think you're right. As Rick was saying, they had a lot of ideas on Tormato, which you can hear on the Rhino re-release, and they don't revisit those. They have some other material in these Paris sessions, a lot of which is not their best work, and we never hear of again. Although John Anderson recycles bits of it.
Well, it's interesting how some of the things that came out of this. I think probably the coolest one that I remember is one called The Golden Age, but it has this really bad synth sound on it that sounds like the theme to some show about doctors in the 70s or something, some TV show theme. You know that one. But I think that's probably my favorite of those leftovers. And then
Richard's my favorite.
Which one?
Richard.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. And some of these showed up on John's solo album Song of Seven later, along with some Tormato leftovers, like a tune called Days.
Yeah, that turned up on Song of Seven.
Yeah. And then there's, Roy Thomas Baker was going to produce this. And it's weird because he went on to do The Cars, And there's a song by them called Hello Again, which sounds strikingly similar to a song from the Paris sessions called Friend of a Friend. Have you ever noticed that or heard about that?
No, I'm not very knowledgeable about the Cars, so that's interesting.
It
I'll
was a
listen
big
to it.
hit here on MTV in the 80s, so that's how I'm familiar with it. And yeah, go check them out sometime, play them back to back. I find it hard to believe there isn't a connection between them. Almost like Roy took that riff with him or something, or played them the Paris session stuff and they took it and made their own song. I could be totally off base, but I don't think so.
Yeah,
So anyway, the other three were working in kind of a power trio direction, almost like Rush or something at the time, writing
yeah.
these riffy songs like Tempest Fugit and Machine Messiah. And
Yeah, and some other stuff as well. I mean, it's been bootlegged, the trio sessions they did, and it's really good. I mean, they could have made an album as a power trio with no keyboards. That could have worked. The one thing that wouldn't have worked was touring as Yes without a keyboard player. So the same thing
oh yeah,
happened later with Magnification.
that,
But I mean, even Relaya, for a while they were thinking about doing it without a keyboard player. But I think ultimately the prior material wasn't playable without a keyboard player, so they ended up taking one. But the interesting thing is, the official story is that Alan White had this ice skating accident in Paris with Richard Branson, and broke his ankle, and that put an end to the Paris sessions. And supposedly, John and Rick's involvement in Yes ended there and then, but in fact, sessions resumed in February, I think, of 80 in London, and John was around a bit, and it'd gone to Barbados, I think, on holiday, and had worked on lyrics for stuff like Tempus Fugit, and which was called the Yes song at that time, and came up with the lyrics, and the others didn't like them, so there was an uneasy situation. But the plan at the time was that they were still intending to make an album together, having completely abandoned the Paris sessions. And Rick Wakeman was supposedly still on the card as a contributor, but was only going to join them during the actual sessions because he was a tax exile in Switzerland. And so there was a period when it seemed like they were actually going to pick up the pieces and finish an album, but then John stopped coming to the writing sessions, and they
And
found themselves as a trio.
we were about to meet the Buggles, and it's interesting when you read interviews with Trevor Horn about this period, because Horn and Downes start working with Howe, Squire and White, but there's clearly a period when they still think John is going to come back and sing this material. They're writing material, and they're excited about working with Yes, but Trevor is saying to Chris, well, when's John going to turn up? John's going to sing this stuff, and then Chris go, yeah, John will turn up. So,
and I don't think Chris was necessarily lying, because maybe he was still thinking. I mean, the idea that John would leave Yes and Yes would continue without him was quite surreal, I think, even to Chris before it actually happened.
very good. Yeah. Well, it's interesting how it all turned out, and it's interesting that some things that wound up on drama were left over from Tormato and Paris sessions. Run Through the Light, I believe, was one of the Paris sessions songs, and pieces of Does It Really Happen was a Tormato tune, totally different arrangement, but I mean, John Anderson came up with the phrase "Does it really happen?" It's in those original lyrics on that Tormato demo.
Henry isn't Patrick Moraz on that song? So it's probably from much earlier on, actually.
I'm never certain whether this has been completely resolved, but it does appear to be, although it was released on the Tomato Rhino reissue as a bonus track, it seems to date back earlier. It seems possibly to have Moraz on it.
Yeah, I believe they called it Everybody's Song. Is that right?
I don't know that we know John wrote the words. He sung the words early on.
Good point.
Maybe Chris's,
But it might have been Chris.
But it is kind of his melody that they used as a
Yeah.
starting off point when Trevor did it.
I mean, and I think Run Through the Light is a quite Andersonic sort of lyrical phrasing for the title of that song. So yeah, we know Does It Really Happen and Run Through the Light date back some way.
Yeah. Another interesting thing is the first song the Buggles worked on with Yes turned out to be We Can Fly From Here, which was played on the Dramaturg, but ended up being recorded much later, 30 years later actually.
Yeah.
They approach Yes with this song.
Yeah.
This is the first song they work together on, and yet it doesn't actually make it to the album, even though there are studio versions of it that seem almost complete, but for some reason it doesn't quite make it. I mean, Drama in the end is a somewhat rushed album, and it's a very short album.
Yeah, 35 minutes or something.
Yeah, but are we all of agreement that Drama and the Buggles were a really good thing to happen to them in hindsight?
Well, certainly he made a very good album. I mean,
I agree. I think it was probably the strongest album they'd made since, I don't know, early. And yeah, I think it was just a perfect bridge to the 80s also, hooking up with some guys that were on the cutting edge of new technology. And I think Jeff's keyboard palette was really tasteful. And I think even to this day, Jeff is known for choosing really good sounds.
Jeff has said it's the album in his career he's most proud of. It's Drama.
Wow.
Okay. Which is interesting. And I think when I sort of first encountered Yes fandom in the mid-90s, Drama was reviled, forgotten. There was these endless Yes fandom in the mid-90s was just endless Yes West versus ABWH arguments, 70s versus 80s arguments, and Drama was doesn't fit, and people just saw it as this weird mistake almost. And it's an album that has very much been rehabilitated, and is a jewel in the crown.
Yeah, it's grown in stature. And I think from an engineering standpoint, next to Fragile, it's the best sounding album from that first decade.
And the issue is whether it's due to Eddie Offord doing the backing tracks, returning with Yes for that, or Hugh Padgham doing the actual engineering on the overdubs and stuff, and of course Trevor Horn being the main producer, although technically it's a Yes collective production, but it was really Trevor's first venture into producing an album, I think.
Yeah, and maybe just the studio that they were using as well was state of the art. Like Eddie's great, but he isn't foolproof. I mean, look at Relayer. He did the best he could with what they had, but they were working a mobile studio in Chris's house. So how good could that sound compared to a state-of-the-art studio? So yeah, this one, did you know that I'm Running dates back to these days, just the bass riff?
Yeah, I think it's in one of the trio sessions.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, that was one where Trevor said that Chris just kept playing that riff, and he's like, all right, we'll write a song around it. Wore me down.
Chris Squire was a notoriously slow producer of music, a writer. He wouldn't let ideas go. He'd bang away at ideas for years and bring them back. And you see that again and again in the history of Yes. Although on Drama, perhaps because he's forced into it by circumstances, we get a huge amount of Squire writing. I mean, he's behind Does It Really Happen, Tempest Fugit, and Run Through the Light, mainly.
Yeah, it's a wonderful. I mean, I really loved what Billy did on the revisited Drama tour. It was I was able to congratulate him backstage after that, and I really meant it, because it's a superb performance as a bass player. And I think every song has some wonderful bass drum interaction, and I'm quite a big fan of this particular aspect of any band. And just what Alan and Chris came up with on this album is it's probably my favorite part of the album. It's
Well, I
just
think
great.
the dynamic between Alan and Chris is just at its peak on this
Yeah.
record. You know, they are locked in, they're aggressive, and it's tight. It's really good. And Steve turns in some of his most concise and tasteful playing. I
Yeah.
think probably because Jeff gave him the room to do it.
Yeah, and the lack of Jeff before Jeff joined also made them a power trio, and that very much influenced the writing. If you listen to the demos, they sound almost like the Police.
I
They're
can
a
see that.
power trio, and it works very well in this respect. I mean,
Well, I
you
think
could
it's
think of
safe
the
to,
songs standing on their own without even the keyboard player.
I think it's safe to say the Police were an influence on Yes
Yeah.
from around this time forward. Even Chris, I mean, he looked like Sting in the early on the 90125 tour. That haircut, come on, he was going for that. So. Um, but yeah, just a great album. Drama has really grown in stature over the years, and rightly so, because it's just so many things came together so beautifully. And no, it's not John Anderson and Rick Wakeman, but it's okay. It's nice sometimes to see what Yes can do when John Anderson isn't around.
Yeah.
You know,
Where that lineup failed ultimately was only when they played live, and Trevor struggled to sing John's lines, which practically anybody would.
sure,
But the album itself and its potential follow-up, I mean, they were really thinking of doing a follow-up. If they had made that follow-up, perhaps they would have gotten rid of the old repertoire and built a personality of their own, and succeeded in that way. But as long as he had to sing "And You and I" and songs like that, which were outside his range, it was too much of a challenge, and
sure. So it was a
didn't work.
short-lived era, but it's interesting. Yeah, and I guess most people know that, the first half of the tour was in the round in the States, and the tickets had been sold before Rick and John left. So, and they didn't really let the audience know. So when the lights came up, people were literally scratching their heads going, "Who
Well,
are these guys?"
the early bits of the tour went on sale before the news was announced, although I think the end of the tour,
By
the
then
news
they
had
knew.
been announced.
But
And
I hear,
the album had been released, but
okay,
it was a different era. I mean, nowadays, if someone sneezes in the band, we know about it because we have the internet.
right.
Everyone's on Facebook.
And word
Um,
traveled slow back then. Even
yeah,
print publications, it would be months out of, before you'd get it in your hands.
yeah.
So it took a while for the word to travel. But I understand that the Americans didn't mind it too much. They were pretty forgiving and enjoyed it. But when they got to the UK, they cried foul and were not nearly as receptive. Is that
Yeah,
true?
UK audiences were less polite, and also it seems Trevor's voice, at the beginning of the tour, he's got range problems. By the end of the tour, his voice is shot. He
Sure.
not only is singing material that's difficult for him, but he doesn't have the experience of singing every night in this way. The Buggles weren't a touring band. He had been a live performer, but mainly as a bass player, and not at this sort of uh, long shows night after night after night.
Sure. I mean, that will wear on, the most seasoned pro. So, but it's important to understand how to use your voice correctly too. And not everybody knows that. I think Benoit David's someone that suffered from that towards the end,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
we'll get into that on our next episode. So, anything else to share about drama? Then I think we'll probably have to wrap it up today, and we will come back and finish the rest of the catalog sometime in December.
Yeah, perhaps the way the lineup ended, which again is shrouded in not exactly in mystery, but it's hard to work out exactly what went on. But part of the band wanted to continue. I think Trevor himself was in doubt whether he wanted to keep doing it, but there were plans. I mean, there were plans to do a second album called Vermilion Sands, which ended up being a track on the second Buggles album. But they had this big meeting early in '81, and in the meantime, Alan and Chris had met Jimmy Page at a Christmas party, and they were more interested in pursuing that. They didn't believe in the band anymore. So as Jeff told you in his interview, they found himself with Steve being the only ones who wanted to continue the band, and eventually they moved on to Asia rather than because they decided they couldn't carry the band on their own.
But it's interesting that they must have thought about it at least for a short moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that would have been interesting, but I think the way things turned out was probably for the best, you know. So basically they split up, and eventually they meet this Trevor Rabin guitarist and come back and do a new band they thought called Cinema. So anyway, that's for part 2. So hold that thought, everybody. You know, this band is just, you know, I couldn't gloss over these records, you know. I'd rather do a couple episodes and go into depth because there's so much to say. And you gentlemen really helped a lot. I think you uncovered some angles that maybe haven't been discussed previously about these records. And I really appreciate that, because that's the whole point of this show, is to hopefully uncover some information that you haven't heard already. You know, if it makes it on your website, Henry, I know I did something right. It's like, okay, there's some fresh stuff.
It's been lovely talking to both of you this evening. I look forward to chapter 2.
Me too. Thanks again for the invitation. It's an honor to be part of this series.
Well, it's always a pleasure chatting with you, even if it's just in writing, you know, at Progressive Ears or elsewhere. But
Yeah.
I've known you guys a long time in that context, and it's a pleasure to put some faces with the names and some voices with the faces.
Absolutely.
All right, so everyone, come back next week. I'm going to be in a yacht rock mode, and I'm going to chat with the drummer from Ambrosia. So come on by. His name's Burley Drummond. And the following week after that, I'm going to dive into the whole yacht rock genre, because I'm kind of a sucker for slick, sophisticated pop music, and that's definitely in that ballpark. So man can't live on prog alone. You know, wouldn't even want to try. All right, y'all, take care. Stay safe. I'll see you, and I'll see you next month.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.
Take care.